Welcome back to Planet Echoes, where the past leans close and breathes secrets into our ears. The first time I saw the fragment, it was under glass that hummed with the quiet dignity of old empires, a sliver of gazelle skin inked in a hand that had never seen Antarctica, and yet drew a coast where textbooks swore there should be only ice. Istanbul's winter pressed against the palace windows like a fellow investigator, fogging the panes while my fingertips hovered, useless and reverent, above the display. If a map can remember a world before the cold, what else might it remember about us? I could feel the centuries watching, the calligrapher's strokes tightening into a question I didn't yet know how to ask. The label said 1929 for the discovery, but the lines belonged to a conversation much older, pulled across time like a thread through a hidden seam. I told myself I had come for measurements and pigments, for dates and fibres and the neat comfort of laboratory facts. Yet as the curator dimmed the room to protect the ink, the map brightened inside me with a kind of unwelcome warmth. It's a strange intimacy, standing with an object that knows places you've never been. The peristyle grid curved like a smile that wouldn't explain itself, and along its grin, unfamiliar capes and river mouths unfolded like a bedtime story told by someone who knows you too well. I checked the known outlines. South America lounging on its side, Africa tilted like a tilted head listening, the Atlantic swaying gently between. Then came the anomaly, the whispered scandal that made careers bristle and skeptics sharpen their pencils, an extension at the bottom edge, a sweep of coast where the southern ice should roar, drawn as if it were listening to warm water. The room smelled of linen, dust and orange oil. Somewhere a clock ticked the same minute again and again. I wrote in my notebook, if this is true, the world isn't finished with its first draft. The archivist cleared his throat the way old paper might, and told me the story they always tell. A roll uncovered in a palace room crowded with forgotten things. A commander cartographer assembling a world from scraps of worlds. A rumour that older charts once breathed beneath newer hands. It should have ended there. Ink meets catalogue. Catalogue meets article. Article argues with article until time smooths us all out. But the coastline at the bottom would not return to silence. I traced the latitude annotations with a pencil held above the glass, not touching, and felt every ship that ever pitched on a black wave reach up through my wrist. When the mind stares long enough at a paradox, it begins to see a person in it. The coast became a face in the dark, and the face seemed to know my name. Later outside I walked the palace gardens where cold air stitched itself into my coat. Cypress trees wrote vertical sentences, the Bosphorus muttered in a tongue older than trade. I tried to talk myself down to the level of rational gravel. Coastlines can be misread, projections can trick the eye, myths love a blank corner. But the odd fact wouldn't let go. Whoever drew that line had drawn it as land, not ice. No scalloped shelf, no fracture marks, no polite marginalia apologising for guesswork. Just the steady confidence of a coast accustomed to touching the sea. Confidence is a dangerous pigment. It stains the skeptic's hands. I remembered the first archaeology dig I ever joined, a village that existed only in the elders' stories and the way the grass grew differently. The map felt like that grass, growing from a soil I hadn't met, insisting the ground beneath my certainty was hollow. I called a friend in climatology only to hang up before the ring completed, ashamed of my urgency. The evidence had to come from the object, not my wish for it. Back inside, under the lowered lights, I studied the marginal notes. Not the famous labels, but the small hesitations where a scribe lingers. There, in the faintest brown, a notation that mentions sources upon sources, a genealogy of oceans. We inherit more than blood, we inherit mistakes and glimpses. And what happens if one glimpse is right? The map didn't feel like a challenge, it felt like a memory clearing its throat after a long sleep. Night pooled around the palace like ink. The curator locked the case, and I watched my own reflection hover over that southern curve. I imagined warm rain on stone that is now bone white and crushing cold. Imagined a shoreline that belonged to someone who never heard the word glaciation. The ground here remembers more than it should. Someone had said that to me once, half joking, before we sank a trowel into loam and found a bead that looked like an eye. In the glass, the coastline looked back. My pen hesitated above the notebook, and then surrendered to a sentence I didn't plan to write. A sentence that felt like stepping onto a bridge before checking how long it had been standing. And that's when I noticed the line that shouldn't exist. A coastline drawn where no sea had ever been. Yet. The word yet hung in my mind like an echo in a canyon, refusing to fade. It wasn't the confident flourish of a map maker filling empty space. It was the kind of mark you leave when you know something to be true, but you also know it shouldn't be. My breath fogged the glass again, and I wondered if the map's creator had ever stood somewhere cold enough to make the air visible. Did he imagine, as I did now, that this ghostly vapour was the earth whispering back? I stepped away from the case, but the southern line followed me, curling around the edges of my thoughts like smoke from an unseen fire. The curator's voice floated toward me, naming the year 1513, and the man, Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral with more seas behind him than years ahead. He had stitched this map together from many others, or so the story went. But what kind of many others included a view of a world that shouldn't have existed in his lifetime or in anyone's recorded history? On the palace steps, the wind off the Bosphorus felt different now. Each gust seemed to carry sand instead of salt, a dry heat beneath the winter air, as though the map's coastline had seeped into the atmosphere and rewired my senses. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine the land without ice. The cliffs would be dark, basalt perhaps, the kind that traps heat and smells like iron after rain. Forests could rise from valleys the ice now crushes into silence. Rivers could braid themselves lazily toward the sea, their mouths swelling with silt and stories. And somewhere along those rivers, someone. The problem with such visions is they don't remain hypothetical for long. You start searching for proof in places where proof doesn't belong. A merchant's log from Alexandria, a faded mural in the shadow of a minaret, the stray mention of southern lands and a sailor's drunken boasting. They cling together, these scraps, until they form the outline of a possibility. And possibilities, I've learned, are more dangerous than facts. Facts can be argued with. Possibilities change the way you dream. That night I couldn't sleep. My room in the old quarter was small, but the walls seemed farther apart, as though the map had unfolded inside it. Shadows stretched into long, sinuous shapes like shorelines I didn't recognise. I lit the single lamp and spread my notes across the bed. Latitude lines, compass roses, marginalia in Ottoman Turkish, some of it already translated, some still waiting for patient eyes. My gaze kept returning to a small annotation near the disputed coastline. The translation read, "This part is drawn from the map of Alexander." Not the Alexander of history books, surely, but some other name bearer, someone whose chart had survived the centuries by slipping unseen through the cracks. If you follow such threads, you must be prepared for the moment they tangle, and tangle they did, into the name of an island that did not appear on any known map of the south, yet matched an oral legend I'd once heard in Patagonia. A people who lived at the bottom of the world, where the sun hid for months, and the sea rose like a wall. Could the cartographer have heard the same story centuries earlier? Could he have believed it enough to give it form in ink? I tried to stop myself there, to close the notebook and reclaim the rational comfort of scepticism, but the coastline would not let me. It had been drawn not as an afterthought, but as a destination, a place the mapmaker expected someone, maybe himself, to go. My hand found the telephone, and again I thought of calling the climatologist friend. Again I hesitated. Without the map in front of them, they would not see what I saw. And even if they did, would they admit it? A tram clattered by outside, pulling me back to the present. I realised my lamp was guttering. The oil was nearly spent. But before darkness could reclaim the room, I made a decision. I would trace the sources the way Piri Rais claimed to have done. I would find their fragments, the ancestor maps, the ones whispered to have been copied from even older ones, those drawn before the ice returned. Somewhere, I thought, there must be another coastline, another clue waiting. And if I could find it, maybe I could understand why this one felt less like a discovery and more like a warning. That warning, I whispered into the dim, might be the reason the map found me at all. Morning kept its distance, as if the sky too feared what the page might say in clear light. I carried that feeling back to the palace archives, where the curator, bleary but game, allowed me one more session. The room welcomed us with the hush of an old library conspirator. The map lay under glass like a sleeping animal deciding whether to trust my hand. I asked for the multi-spectral lamp they used for faded marginalia, and he raised an eyebrow that said he'd seen Hope dressed like science before. Still, he fetched it, and I promised myself that whatever the light revealed, I would let it speak without forcing it to agree with me. There's a humility that instruments demand. The lamp hummed, and the skin brightened through bands our eyes never earn on their own. Faint annotations bloomed in soft violets and pale greens, corrections, coordinates, fragmentary citations. One note unfurled near the southern line like a leaf in spring. Not a place name, not a latitude, but a tiny drawing of a bird I didn't recognise, its beak long and curved, sketched as if from memory. The curator leaned closer, and I felt the air change, the way it does before a confession. He said nothing, but his silence throbbed with the word, why? Why a bird at the edge of an impossible coast? I knew that curve. Months earlier, in a museum on loan, I had stood before a case of Patagonian petroglyph rubbings. Among them, a bird with a similar beak, carved beside waves, and a sun drawn low on the horizon. In that carving, the bird had always pointed west, toward a thing the label called unknown waters. On this map, the bird's beak pointed south, as if it had turned its head after centuries and finally noticed the truth below it. A silly coincidence, I told myself, until I noticed another soft detail, a smear of crystalline dust caught in a crack of the parchment, sparkling under violet like a shy star. I asked permission, and with the gentlest microbrush lifted a grain for examination. Under a cheap pocket scope, it felt almost profane to use such an ordinary tool in a room this solemn. The particles looked like sea salt crystals fused with something stranger, a lacework pattern I'd seen only in photographs, the silica skeletons of diatoms, not the types that favour polar shelves, but a warm water species common to temperate coastal shallows. It was the smallest fact, the kind that could warp into error if you breathed on it too hard. Yet there it was, an echo of warm sea caught in a map that shouldn't know a warm south. I felt the first soft twist of the day. It wasn't just the ink that remembered. The parchment carried a trace of the climate it described. Every discovery begs for a larger mouth, so we brought the conservation chemist in. She glanced between us, amused by our hunger. With a whisper of approval, she prepared the lamp again, shifting wavelengths like a conductor coaxing a hidden melody. The southern coast sharpened in false colour, not breaking up into hesitations as guesswork often does, but holding its line like a path worn by many feet. Along its sweep, I counted 3 river mouths, the way you count heartbeats in the dark, hoping to be wrong, fearing to be right. A coastline that drinks from rivers is not an accident. What river carves beneath a sheet of ice thicker than cathedrals? Outside the window, the Bosphorus flashed a thin coin of winter light. Inside, the curator finally surrendered to the temptation of story. He recounted an entry from a 19th century catalogue, one I hadn't seen, that mentioned an Ottoman scribe copying fragments of the Franks and of the ancients before the Franks, and of the southern navigators. Southern navigators. The phrase felt theatrical, like a line cut from a play that only Ocean remembers. I could see the Admiral's table, drunk with scraps, vellum whispers, sailors' boasts, a monk's squared-off letters, a worn edge that once wrapped a scroll. We inherit more than facts. We inherit how other hands shook while writing them. At noon, I left the palace to clear the pressure building behind my eyes. The wind carried gulls upriver, their wings creaking like old doors. I walked a hill of bookshops that had burned and been rebuilt more than once, and in one of them the owner recognised the way I held my shoulders, as if I expected a door to open behind me into a room I didn't deserve. He led me to a shelf of maritime odds and ends, and put into my hands a thin codex of Portolan notes, a copy of a copy, the ink steady and sure. On the third page, squeezed between capes and currents, a marginal hand had drawn the same bird with the long beak, facing south, its eye rendered as a simple dot. No flourish, no saintly halo, only attention. I returned to the archive with the codex trembling in my bag. The chemist smiled like a cat who has smelled cream. We layered the images in our minds, then with light. Bird to bird, mouth to mouth, coast to coast. The lamp moved to the map's margin, to the spaces where corrections pile up like autumn leaves. A faint geometry surfaced, grids beneath grids, someone's draft work barely erased. My breath tangled in my throat. Beneath the visible coast, a ghost of another line traced in a slightly different hand shifted like a second melody under the first. It wasn't a correction. It was older, surer, the kind of line you make when your eye recognises a shape your mind refuses to name. The curator's key scraped softly in the lock as he lowered the blinds. We all leaned, heads nearly touching the glass, our reflections layered over those twin coasts. The chemist toggled the wavelength one notch further into dark violet, and the room folded into a hush so complete that even the city stopped breathing. I saw it then, not with the thrill of conquest, but with the ache of recognition, like hearing your childhood name called in a crowd. Because hidden beneath the ink there was another map. The words barely formed in my mind before their weight settled into my chest. It was not a shadow, not an accidental bleed from another page. It was a map with the calm authority of something older than all of us in that room. The chemist's voice was hushed when she asked the curator to hold the light steady, as though raising her tone might wake the wrong thing. What emerged wasn't a complete chart. It was fractured, like shards of pottery reassembled without the missing pieces. Yet even in its incompleteness, it spoke with a clarity the surface map lacked. The lines were finer, almost trembling with precision, as if the cartographer had drawn them from memory and longing. Coastlines curved with intimate confidence, their proportions subtly different from the visible map above them. There was no decorative compass rose, no flourishes, only the bare geometry of the world as it might have been before the world we know. My eyes fell again to that southern extremity, and the land there was not a hazy guess, but a living presence, no glaciers, no abrupt cliff into white oblivion. Instead, a gentle taper of land where rivers laced out like fingers into a dark, temperate sea. I didn't speak for fear of breaking whatever spell allowed us to see it. The curator leaned in so close his breath fogged the glass, and the chemist adjusted the lamp until the older ink glowed like embers caught in deep ash. My mind kept returning to a question it did not want to answer. If the surface map was from 1513, then when was this one? And if it had been copied, what was the age of the map before it? Outside, a bell struck the hour, a deep sound that seemed to come from under the floor instead of above the city. I realised my hands were gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white, as though holding on to the world the way I'd been taught it was. The chemist finally straightened, rubbing the bridge of her nose, and said she'd seen something like this only once, in a palimpsest manuscript where a medieval prayer had been written over a Roman merchant's shipping log. The older text had survived not out of reverence, but because no one had cared enough to erase it completely. That was the quiet horror here. This older map hadn't been erased with malice. It had simply been overwritten as the ice returned, as new coastlines replaced old in the minds of men. If the ice erased the land, perhaps the land erased itself from memory. I felt the faint dizziness that comes from standing too close to a precipice. This was no longer just a curiosity. It was evidence that the world's shape had shifted in human memory, and that someone had seen it before the shift. The curator's hand hovered over the case as though he might touch it. "We're not supposed to keep the lamp on this long," he murmured, "but we can photograph it." I nodded without thinking. The chemist fetched a camera fitted for low-light imaging, her movements brisk, as though the longer we delayed, the more likely the map would decide to hide again. Each click felt like stealing a moment from something that didn't belong to us. Later, as the curator filed the images, I paced the narrow aisles between shelves stacked with brittle ledgers and rolled charts. In one dim corner I found a tube labelled in a hand I couldn't place. Inside was a half-finished chart of the South Atlantic. Coarse work, but one edge showed a ghostly continuation of the same southern coastline we'd just uncovered. It was fainter, less confident, but still there, like an echo one tide behind. Whoever drew it had either seen the older map or remembered enough of it to keep the shape alive. By the time I left the palace, night had already spilled over the city. Street lamps caught the mist rising from the Bosphorus, turning it into molten gold. My mind replayed the southern land over and over, and with each replay it grew more solid, more inevitable. Somewhere in the archives, other pieces might wait, drawn on skins carved into stone, whispered in logbooks in hands long buried. The thought both thrilled and unsettled me. If we could find enough fragments to reconstruct the whole, we might glimpse the world as it was before the ice. But as I reached my lodgings and closed the door, the thrill soured into unease. That older world had vanished for a reason. Land that fertile and unclaimed does not simply disappear without witnesses, or without consequence, and if there were witnesses, their silence is its own kind of map, pointing to a truth they chose not to pass down. I sat at the small desk, lit a lamp, and began sketching the hidden coastline from memory, each curve etched into me now like an old scar. The rivers, the capes, the gentle southern taper. My hand moved almost without my consent. When the sketch was complete, I set down the pencil and stared at it, a shiver crawling slow along my spine, because in drawing it, I realised I had added something the hidden map had not shown. A small chain of islands just off the coast, as if I had always known they were there. I stared at my own sketch, the graphite still shining where the lamp caught it, and felt an embarrassment so sharp it bordered on fear. The hand that had drawn those islands was mine, but the certainty behind the strokes didn't feel like it belonged to me. It felt borrowed. Worse, it felt remembered. Tried to justify it. Perhaps I had unconsciously filled in a cartographic harmony, the way a musician's fingers find a chord they've played 100 times. But I had never charted this sea, never even believed it existed until yesterday. The islands sat where the eye wanted them, yes, but also where some older mind insisted they must be. I tore the page from my notebook, laid it beside the photographs we had taken, and compared. No islands. The palimpsest whispered only of the coast and its rivers, of capes and bays under a kinder sun. Yet in my bones I could hear surf splitting around rock, the way waves sound when they meet resistance with a pleasant percussive certainty. Memory, fantasy. What mattered was that my sketch had given the world a piece of itself it hadn't asked for. I crumpled the page, then stopped, smoothed it flat again, and traced the dots. 3 principal islets, a broken crescent, and a 4th, small and solitary to the east like an afterthought. The pattern tugged at me like a half-remembered melody. I placed my fingertip on the lone eastern dot, and a word rose uninvited to my mouth. 4 syllables, round and salt bright, not from any language I'd studied. It snapped against my teeth like a seed husk, startling me so much I spoke it aloud. The sound unsettled the room. Outside, a tram's bell answered as if it had overheard my trespass. Where had I learned that word? The mind is a web. Pluck one thread and the whole lattice trembles. In the tremor, a childhood scene returned. A bedside globe that glowed from within, its bulb burning warm through thin paper oceans. I used to spin it until the continents blurred into a copper smear, then stop it with one finger and pretend that wherever I touched was mine to know. One night, half asleep, I had whispered that same 4-syllable word and placed my finger down in a blind air. In the morning, my finger had a small ink dot at the very bottom of the globe, just above the printed line of latitude I couldn't yet read. The scientific impulse snapped back like a safety line. Coincidence, suggestion, the mind's appetite for patterns. I breathed a slow, grounding breath and focused on what I could test. If those islands were more than invention, the older map might hint at them in ways our eyes had skipped. I returned to the palace, the sketch tucked like contraband. The curator and chemist were gone for the day, but the guard knew me now and let me into the study room. Without the lamp, I could only peer at the map's visible layer, a compromise that soothed my rational pride. I studied the waterlines along the southern coast, the way they feathered toward the open sea. There, near the curve where my pencil had placed the crescent, the ink grew slightly denser, not a mark exactly, more a hesitation in the scribe's hand. Had his quill lifted to dot a reef? Had he wiped it, leaving a ghost of intent? I took out the sketch, set it beside the case, and felt like a child holding a counterfeit coin next to a king's ransom. Yet the counterfeit had a stubborn dignity. The dotted arc matched a rhythm in the waterlines. The way the shoreline's swell suggested underwater ridges rising to kiss the light. Science prefers caution. The sea does not. It tells you what it is by breaking itself against you. I whispered the word again, softer this time, as if I might startle it into meaning. The room didn't change. My hunger did. Back in my lodging, I opened an atlas of currents I'd purchased from the bookshop on the hill. It was modern, confident, full of tidy arrows striding across imagined blue. If the southern coast were real and ice-free, where would warm currents gather? Where would eddies spin fat and permanent enough to feed life, to trap silt, to build the bones of islands? My pencil found the old rhythm again, tapping at the page as if listening for hollow wood. The answer coalesced with a quiet conviction, exactly where I had placed them. A personal hallucination had begun to dress itself as a model, and I felt the part of me that worships method recoil, even as the rest of me pressed closer. When reason fails, confession sometimes works. I wrote to myself as if I were a stranger. You added islands you cannot justify. You spoke a word you cannot source. Either you're embellishing a mystery out of hunger, or the mystery is enlarging you to fit itself. The line frightened me with its grandiosity, but it steadied my hands. I needed another anchor, something outside me that agreed or refused to. Night again, the window a black mirror. I fell asleep at the desk, cheek on the sketch, and drifted into a tide pool of images. Basalt steps, black and wet. Birds with curved beaks skating the wind. A narrow channel between rocks where the sea flowed like breath through a sleeping mouth. In the dream, I stepped onto a beach of dark sand that squeaked underfoot, and lights moved inland like lanterns held low. When I woke, the lamp had burned itself out. My mouth was full of that same 4-syllable name, and my palm, pressed all night to the paper, wore a grey crescent of graphite like a bruise. I washed the mark away, but the shape wouldn't leave, and for the first time since I had seen the hidden map, I was sure of something that did not ask my permission to be sure. Those islands existed, whether on paper or under ice, whether in the past or now. They had carried a name long enough to find its way into a child's mouth and back out again, changed but intact. The question was no longer if they were real. The question was who had named them first and why they wanted me to remember. That distinction changed everything. It shifted the weight from geography to intention, from coordinates to the kind of history that hides in people's mouths rather than on their maps. I could almost feel a presence, not in the haunted sense, but in the way a memory waits for the right moment to surface. Whoever named them had trusted the name to travel, through storms, through ice, through centuries, and somehow it had found me. That suggested a chain, a lineage of keepers, and if I could find even one link, I might pull the whole thread free. I started with the obvious, the word itself. I wrote it phonetically, then in every alphabet I knew, watching the curves and angles change character like actors in different costumes. I searched old glossaries of Polynesian navigation terms, scraps of Basque fishermen's slang, fragments of Arawakan and Yamana vocabulary. Each time I thought I saw a resemblance, it unravelled into coincidence. The closest was in a list of extinct words from a language spoken on an island chain now submerged, a word for between waters. It was tempting to claim it, but the resemblance was slippery, the way clouds pretend to form faces until you blink. When language failed, I turned to imagery. I sketched the islands again, this time from the dream, adding the black sand beach and the beak-curved birds. The composition had a strange symmetry, the way the islands arranged themselves into a crescent like an open mouth. The solitary fourth island to the east broke the balance, but in a way that made the whole pattern feel alive as though it were listening. I sent the drawing to an old colleague in ornithology with no explanation except, "What bird does this remind you of?" He wrote back a single word, "Scimitar bill." An African bird, curved and deliberate, no relation to the southern seas. Yet the shape was exact. That answer sat wrong in my chest. The scimitar bill belonged to savannas, not frozen coasts or lost archipelagos, but sometimes meaning hides in migration, in the detours species take when climate forces their wings elsewhere. I pulled records of bird fossils found on sub-Antarctic islands during brief thaws in Earth's history. A few species had no clear descendants, their bones telling of beaks suited for probing sand and rock. One note from a 1950s expedition mentioned unfamiliar curvature in a beak fragment found on a now ice-buried shore. No one had followed up. The fragment was locked in a university drawer thousands of miles away. That night I dreamed again, not of the islands themselves, but of a map room I did not recognise. The table was long, its wood pale and salt-stained with maps pinned under river stones. There were no electric lights, only oil lamps, their flames bending toward the centre as if drawn by breath. A man I could not fully see traced a finger along the same southern coast, paused where my island sat and looked straight at me. His eyes were grey, not in the way of colour, but in the way a morning fog eats distance. He said the name, my name for them, but slower, as if he were returning it to me with pieces I had lost. I woke with a compulsion so sharp it hurt, to return to the palace and the hidden map. Morning light barely touched the city when I was already at the gates. The curator was surprised but let me in, his curiosity tempered by the growing sense that whatever I was chasing, it would not be content to remain ink on skin. I brought my sketch of the islands, set it beside the magnified images of the palimpsest, and began to study the water beyond the coast. The currents, as drawn, hinted at something, a convergence point, a place where warm and cold water met like two voices in harmony. Such places are fertile, abundant, and dangerous to navigate. The curator fetched a small case from a shelf and opened it to reveal a rolled vellum fragment, brittle at the edges. "This came with the Peary chart," he said. "We never identified its origin." I unrolled it and felt my throat tighten. The coastline was crude but familiar, and in the sea just off it, 3 small dots in a crescent and a fourth to the east. No names, no birds, only the shape. The hand that drew it had no doubt. The fragment smelled faintly of smoke, as if it had survived a fire. I traced the islands with my fingertip, half expecting the old word to rise again, and it did. Stronger, clearer, like it had been waiting for this confirmation. The curator watched my expression but didn't press. "Some believe," he said quietly, "that maps do not just record places, they remember them, and they choose who gets to see." I wanted to dismiss it, but the room felt different, as though the fragment had shifted the air itself. In that moment, my curiosity became obligation. The name was not mine to invent, the islands not mine to imagine. They had existed, and someone had wanted them remembered badly enough to hide them in layers of ink, to whisper them through generations, to place them in the mouth of a child spinning a globe. Now they had surfaced again, and the question pressed harder than ever. If they wanted me to remember, then perhaps they also wanted me to go. The sentence felt like a key turned from the inside, the kind that unlocks you before it unlocks any door. I stood in the archive with the fragment unrolled and the hidden coast lingering like after-image on the eyes. To go where, though? Into a latitude band wrapped in winter steel? Into a story that had chosen me long before I knew its grammar? The curator watched me pace the narrow corridor of lamps and ledgers, his hands tucked behind his back in a posture half prayer, half restraint. The journey sounded absurd, but absurdity has a way of wearing sense like a borrowed coat once you've stared at a paradox long enough. What would I be chasing? Ink, memory, a ghost of warm seas under present ice? Or was the chase itself the point? A test to see if I would carry the name all the way to its wind? I took the vellum fragment to the window and let noon light pass through it, a parchment-stained glass. The three islets and their eastern sibling hung against the sky, the way a constellation does before anyone has drawn lines between its stars. What if the lines were never lines at all, but crossings, safe water amid black teeth? The shape suggested a passage, a narrow breathing of sea between rocks. Who first learned to slip through it, and who last? The questions crowded like gulls over a single scrap of fish. I let them rattle, and then set them down. Questions are a tide, and you drown if you try to drink them. Still, one kept bobbing back. If the map remembered an ice-free south, what calendar did it keep? Could a coastline be drawn true by eyes that lived centuries before the ice's return? I went to the hill of bookshops again, letting the cobbles tutor my feet into patience. In a shop that smelled of rope and fennel, I found an atlas of early modern sea ice reports, captain's logbook summaries, distilled to careful headings like package sighted and Bergy water. Dry words, but each sentence hit a heartbeat. On a winter of 1774, one captain wrote of a stretch of black and breathing water far south of where it should be. Was that a capricious Paulina, a storm-flung corridor in the floes, or a memory the sea kept repeating to itself? Who decides which anomalies are noise, and who profits when we erase them? At night, back in my room, I laid out tools the way sailors lay out lines. Notebook, the fragment copy, my island sketch, a slim volume on southern ocean currents, and a small brass coin taken as a superstition from a ship display case. A coin stamped with a bird I could not name, beak curved like a question mark. I rolled it across my knuckles, and the motion stilled my mind into work. I traced the likely path from Cape Town's ancient harbour lanes to the coil of currents that circle the world like a belt. The circumpolar flow is a river pretending to be an ocean, and rivers remember where to slow, where to spill, where to leave silt and song. Would a wooden hull survive the knife wind? Would any human voice carry long enough to name islands between storms? The practicalities began to assemble themselves without asking my permission. Passage south with a research vessel wintering in Punta Arenas. A window of temperate weather that was really just a smaller enemy. layers of clothing, instruments borrowed from friends who preferred not to hear why. I told myself I was only testing a hypothesis about currents amplifying polynyas near submerged topography. But hypotheses do not surface in dreams with lamps bending toward maps, and they don't leave a 4-syllable bead of salt on your tongue when you wake. Who gave you that word? Why did they trust you to carry it? I returned to the palace at dawn to say goodbye to the map like you say goodbye to a grandfather who pretends not to see you weeping. The curator unlocked the case and, against protocol, allowed me a final minute with the glass bare of any veil. The hidden lines slept under the visible ones, confident as roots. I placed my palm above the southern curve and said the name under my breath. Somewhere behind me a floorboard, settled, an old building exhaling. I imagined the earlier hands, admirals, scribes, nameless copiers, each believing they were rescuing a shape from forgetting. Did they also feel chosen, or merely burdened? As I turned to leave, the chemist hurried in, cheeks flushed with the kind of news that forgets to knock. She held a slim envelope of fresh spectral prints. "Look," she said, and spread them like cards. There, ghost fine but indisputable, was a faint lattice radiating from the crescent of islands, a geometry of bearings as if someone had plotted approaches, distances, the dance a cautious helmsman would follow to thread a needle at sea, a route where no route should be. Who sails toward a place the world doesn't admit exists? I felt the coin in my pocket grow warm against my leg, a ridiculous sensation I refused to dignify with notice. But the decision, already made inside the sentence I'd spoken yesterday, clarified as calm. I would go south with the research vessel. I would carry the fragment's shape in my mind and the name in my mouth, and see if the sea would answer with land. If I returned empty, I would still have learned what it meant to be summoned by an outline. If I did not return, well, the map had endured rougher hands than mine. Outside, the wind off the Bosphorus smelt faintly of kelp, though no kelp grows there. A gull levelled its body into the gust as if obeying a line taught to it by an older sky. I walked toward the station to make the first of many arrangements, feeling less like a traveller than like a letter finally entrusted to the post. The city thinned behind me into the clatter of rails and the quiet arithmetic of timetables. Was I chasing a vanished summer, or letting it chase me? Either way, I told the air, the next thing I learn will be waiting for me at the waterline. It felt like a vow, though I didn't know whether it was to myself or to the map, or to whatever memory had set this chain of events in motion long before I could name it. The waterline, I imagined, wasn't just the edge of sea against land. It was the threshold where two versions of the world meet, cross it, and you either return with the truth or you're changed into something that can no longer live in the life you left behind. In the days that followed, preparations took on the quiet momentum of inevitability. The research vessel Tern was docked in Punta Arenas, awaiting a refit before her next southbound mission. I secured a place by leaning on old academic favours and presenting my purpose in the driest possible terms, a comparative study of anomalous cartographic features and their correlation with oceanic microclimate anomalies. No mention of 4-syllable names or hidden coasts beneath 500 years of ink. I found myself walking the docks at dawn, listening to the cranes groan and the gulls circle with their cruel laughter. Ships are never silent. Even moored, they creak like old men muttering to themselves. The Tern was no different. Her hull was steel grey, weather-worn, but her deck had the trim precision of a vessel that respected her own survival. I ran a hand along the railing, feeling the faint vibration of the tide against her mass. It was absurd to imagine that she too might know where we were going, yet the thought arrived unbidden. Ships remember, just like maps do. Back in my rented room, I laid out the fragment copy beside my notes. I studied the plotted bearings that radiated from the crescent of islands, their geometry more deliberate than I had first realised. Whoever had drawn them had not been guessing. These were not decorative lines or random angles. They were approaches, each one a thread into the mouth of a hidden harbour. I began to see them as a choreography, a pattern of movement designed not just to reach the islands, but to avoid something. A reef, a current, or eyes watching from the shore. I slept poorly, dreams cycling between glassy seas and storms that folded the horizon in half. Always the dream ended with the sight of those basalt steps from the earlier vision, black as if the night had been poured over them. The beak-curved birds wheeled above, their shadows falling in arcs that matched the island's crescent. Once, in the dream, I raised my hand and one bird landed on my wrist, lighter than I expected, its dark eye reflecting something behind me I couldn't turn to see. I woke with the sensation of its talon still pressing my skin. 2 days before departure, I returned to the palace archives one last time. The curator was away, but the chemist was there, sorting through trays of pigment samples. She saw the determination in my face and without a word fetched the spectral lamp. We studied the palimpsest again, but this time I focused not on the coast or islands, but on the sea around them. Under certain wavelengths, faint hatching marks appeared, like ripples sketched quickly. They clustered most densely near the easternmost island, the solitary one. I remembered my dream's bird perched and watching, as if guarding that precise point. Could be depth shading, the chemist suggested, but it's inconsistent. She adjusted the filter, and the lines resolved into something else entirely. Tiny repeating arcs, each with a dot at its centre. Not ripples, not depths, symbols. I didn't recognise them, but I knew with an irrational certainty they were meant to warn. Walking back through the city, I kept picturing those arcs and dots, how they seemed to pulse under the glass. The sun had already slipped low, painting the Bosphorus in brass and shadow. I imagined the waterline again, not as a clean demarcation, but as a trembling seam stitched poorly between eras. Somewhere, under that seam, the islands waited with whatever had prompted those warnings. That night I packed with deliberate slowness, a notebook for observations, a copy of the vellum fragment, folded into oilskin, the brass coin, now warm whenever I held it too long, a pair of gloves thick enough to hold cold rope but nimble enough for turning fragile pages. I told myself the gloves were for deck work, but another part of me suspected I might need them to touch something older than steel or ink. On the morning of my flight south, the chemist pressed a sealed envelope into my hand at the dock. "In case you find them," she said, without saying what "them" meant. The paper was thin, the envelope light, but it felt heavier than my entire pack. I didn't open it. Some messages are meant to be read at the exact place they were intended for, not before. The Tern's engines rumbled and the quay drifted away. I stood at the stern, watching the city sink into haze, the wind sharpening with each mile. In the far distance, the waterline shimmered in sunlight, a line I knew was only a trick of the eye, a place that moves as you move, never letting you catch it. And yet, in my chest, it felt fixed, waiting. Somewhere beyond it lay the truth the map had guarded, the name that had survived ice and ink, and perhaps the reason it had chosen to be remembered at all. And as the land dwindled behind me, I understood something simple and dangerous. The map wasn't guiding me to the islands were guiding me to something else. That certainty settled over the deck like a second weather, unforecast, undeniable, rearranging every small plan into a larger intention I couldn't quite name. The Tern slid south on a seam of grey water, her bow lifting and setting, as if she were reading a text stitched into the waves. I kept to the rail when I could, breathing the cold until it bit through, listening for the ship's old wood creaks inside her steel. Imaginary, I knew, but I heard them anyway. What waits for you at the end of a line you didn't draw? The sky had the flat intensity of a blade. Even the gulls that followed us for scraps seemed to know we were going someplace that wouldn't forgive a mistake. The crew was polite in the way professionals are when they sense someone's purpose is stranger than their title. The chief scientist, Roas, had eyes like lit coals and a habit of tapping out metronomes on the bulkhead with 2 fingers. "We'll get you close enough for your current maps," she said, making current do double duty, dare and dismissal. I showed her my overlays and spoke about polynyas and bathymetry, about upwelling and eddies rich with diatoms. I didn't speak about birds sketched in margins or names that taste like salt when whispered at night. But even while I talked, the older logic kept working beneath the words. If the islands were a lure, what was the hook? 2 days out, the ocean thickened into long black silk. The horizon narrowed to a taut string. At night, the wake stitched briefly with bioluminescence, a ghost handwriting that erased itself as it wrote. I stood there until my fingers numbed, watching the glow-shaped letters Asgul pretended not to recognise. What message does the sea keep writing to itself? Below deck, I spread the fragment copy and my sketch on a chart table sticky with coffee rings, aligning bearings with the ship's course. The approach lines from the palimpsest formed a starburst that wasn't centred on the islands themselves, but a little east, precisely where the solitary dot would cast a shadow at sunrise. You don't chart the sun, I told myself, and yet whoever drew those lines had charted something that moved. On the 3rd afternoon, the wind fell away like a thought forgotten mid-sentence. The world went quiet except for the hull's small arguments with the swell. Rojas sent down the towfish for a shallow side-scan pass. We all leaned into the monitors as the grayscale ribbon unrolled. At first, featureless hum, a soft carpet. Then, striations, soft ridges like the ribs of a sleeping animal. And there, 2 shapes rising from the seabed in a lazy curve, not rock, not wreck, too regular to be accident. "Drumlins," someone said, "ice-sculpted hills." But the arc they drew echoed my dotted crescent so precisely my mouth dried. Can ice carve a memory into the seafloor and then bury the thing that remembers? That night the Tern shuddered in a short, mean sea. I lay awake listening to the bow lift and fall, each time expecting a different impact that never came. In the mess, a deckhand told a story about a previous voyage and a station that had gone dark for 3 days, while all its clocks kept perfect time. He laughed as he told it, but he didn't laugh at the end. I went back on deck and found the stars thin and strained, as if they too were travelling and late for something. A cold petrel ghosted our wake, cutting silent arcs that matched the symbol I'd seen under the lamp, curves with dots at the centre, the geometry of an eye. Rojas caught me there and angled her shoulder against the wind. "What is it you think you're going to find?" she asked, not unkindly. I tried to answer with the language of currents and coastal refraction, but the truth stepped through my mouth before I could stop it. A passage, not just through ice. She considered that longer than was comfortable. "Passages go both ways," she said, and left me with that small, heavy sentence like a coin. In the morning, the air turned glassy and too bright, the kind of light that smooths distance into false intimacy. A temperature front made its slow, enormous decision right above us. The ocean wore a sheen like breath on a mirror. The Tern's sonar painted a smear to starboard, a shadow in the water column as if something dense and vertical rose up, then ducked away. "Whale?" a tech guessed. "Rock?" said another. The smear appeared again, nearer this time, then vanished as if embarrassed by attention. I felt the old 4-syllable name rise in my throat and forced it back down. Names invite things closer. By the 5th day, birds multiplied, though we were far from any charted rookery. They were not scimitar bills, of course, but their beaks curved in the same deliberate way, as if sculpted by a shared purpose. They rode the invisible architecture of air above the swell. They turned in unison toward an empty piece of sea east of our plotted course, and then, as if remembering themselves, away. What do birds remember that we've trained ourselves to forget? I raised my binoculars and caught, on one bird's leg, a loop of bright thread, as if it had flown through a place that frays human things. Near dusk the sea opened, a long unlikely tongue of dark water parting pale flows. Not a storm tear. The edges were too clean, too patient. A polinia sat ahead of us like a pupil dilating. Rojas swore softly in Spanish and adjusted the helm with an intent I'd seen only in surgeons. The opening lay exactly where the palimpsest's bearings met, 5 lines converging into a narrow throat. The eastern edge of the lead glinted with a low ridge. Not ice, something darker. The deck crew clustered, their silence stacking on mine. The brass coin in my pocket warmed until it felt alive. The engine note shifted as we nosed into the black lane. Somewhere under the hull the sonar pinged and did not return. The birds wheeled once and vanished as if cut from the sky. The wind fell away for a single heartbeat, and in that held breath I understood that the waterline I had promised myself to reach was not a line at all, but a hinge. What opens when you touch it? What closes behind you? And there, on the far side of the Polinia, something began to lift out of the water, slow as a held note. Black as basalt, stepped like the dream, and precisely where no chart admitted any land could be. It rose without hurry, as if time itself deferred to its emergence. The steps were broad, their edges softened by centuries of surf, but the geometry was unmistakable. No whim of ice, no careless violence of rockfall. These had been cut. The sea, usually a restless narrator, seemed to quiet itself, as though reluctant to speak over the thing it was showing us. The crew stood at the rails in a silence that felt older than the ship, their breath pluming like signal flags. Rojas's hands were steady on the helm, but her eyes betrayed that unblinking awe you see in people who've been trained never to admit surprise. The structure, if structure it was, breathed between each swell, its wet surfaces catching the cold light like oil-slick stone. I counted 7 risers before the water swallowed the rest. They ascended toward a flat shelf that just breached the surface, large enough for a house, a signal fire, or the footprint of a vanished thing. My first thought was to mark its position, but the coordinates would be meaningless in any conventional record. Without the map in my mind, it would only ever be unconfirmed feature in a survey log. I reached into my pocket and felt the brass coin, hot now, almost uncomfortable. The ship's motion shifted as Rojas eased us closer, her voice low into the radio to the engine room. A flock of those beak-curved birds appeared without warning, gliding low, their wingtips nearly combing the water. They wheeled in a slow spiral above the higher step, crying in voices that did not sound like any polar species I knew. One broke formation and landed on the flat shelf, folding its wings as though returning home. Something in me broke its own formation then. I pulled out the fragment copy and laid it flat on the rail, the cold wind trying to lift it from my hands. The easternmost dot in the crescent, that solitary island, lay exactly where the steps met the shelf. The bearings radiating from the palimpsest aligned with the channel we had threaded to get here. This was no accident. It was a destination deliberately hidden, yet also designed to be found by those who could read the right lines. The engines rumbled down to idle. The Tern rocked in the slight swell, her hull murmuring in a language I was starting to half understand. Rojas approached, her shadow falling across the fragment. "We can't linger," she said, her voice tight. "This lead could close on us in minutes." But she didn't order us away. Instead, she gestured toward the launch cradle. 10 minutes, no more. Take the small boat if you're going to set foot on it." I didn't ask her why she was letting me go, only nodded. The inflatable hit the water with a hiss and a slap, and I clambered down into it, my gloves biting the rope with cold stubbornness. The 2 deckhands with me didn't speak as we motored toward the steps. The basalt was slick with algae so fine it shimmered in green-blue threads. I placed a boot on the first riser. and the sound it made under my weight, hollow, resonant, was like knocking on a door no one had touched in centuries. Each step was broader than my stride, forcing me into a rhythm that felt oddly ceremonial. The birds wheeled above, their shadows chasing mine. On the fifth riser, I noticed shallow grooves cut across the width, spaced evenly, too deliberate to be erosion. A deckhand muttered that they looked like channels for draining water, but I thought they looked more like script, each groove a mark in a sentence I couldn't yet read. When I reached the shelf, the wind dropped. The sea's voice fell to a whisper, waves lapping like they feared to be heard. From this vantage I could see that the flat surface wasn't flat at all. It was pocked with depressions, some shallow, some deep enough that darkness pooled in them like ink. In the largest hollow lay a scatter of objects I couldn't place. Smooth, fist-sized stones, each carved with a curve and a central dot, identical to the warning marks hidden in the palimpsest. My breath felt suddenly too loud. I crouched, running a gloved hand over one of the stones. The groove was warm, impossibly so, as though it had been resting in the sun instead of under polar light. My fingers itched to turn it over, but I hesitated. The thought came unbidden. These were not left here for you to take. The deckhands called from below. Our time was running out. I stood, letting my gaze sweep the horizon. The Polinia's edges were already feathering with thin ice, knitting the way a wound closes. Beyond, the white glare of the pack ice loomed, indifferent, patient. I took one last look at the carved stones, then stepped back to the edge, my boot soles leaving wet crescents on the dark basalt. As we pushed off, the bird on the shelf lifted into the air, circling once before disappearing into the haze. The steps sank inch by inch behind us, the shelf going under as though it had never risen at all. The tern turned her bow northward, engines deepening to their steady, human rhythm. I sat in the stern of the launch, the coin heavy in my pocket, the image of those carved stones burning in my mind. And I knew with the kind of certainty that makes sleep impossible, this place was not the end of the map's message. It was the first word of a sentence that had been waiting centuries to be spoken. The phrasing would not leave me. It nested under my ribs and breathed there, as if the sentence itself needed my body to keep warm in this latitude. Back aboard the Tern, the deck's familiar sway failed to steady my thoughts. I kept seeing the carved stones in the basin, their curved lines and central dots repeating the hidden warning signs we'd found beneath the ink. Rojas studied my face the way captains study weather, without need of instruments. "You look like someone who heard their name from a mouth that isn't human," she said, not as an accusation but as a diagnosis. She was right. The island, or whatever name the future would accept, had spoken in a grammar of stone and water, and I had understood just enough to be in danger of understanding more. I tried to retreat into the safety of data. In the lab, I spread our side scan ribbons beside the fragment copy and measured the distances between the two seabed rises that had mirrored the crescent. Numbers behave even when you don't, and their obedience is a comfort. The ratios made a quiet kind of sense, a geometry that suggested intention rather than chance. A corridor for approach, a threshold. What happens to a mind when thresholds proliferate? It begins to suspect that every door is a deliberate arrangement of space, and every silence is a word you haven't yet learned to pronounce. Sleep came as a bargain, not a gift. Each time I closed my eyes, I stepped again onto those black risers. Each time, the grooves across them flexed, not as drains but as script, the shallow cuts filling with silver water until they gleamed like lines of quicksilver text. I woke with the taste of the 4-syllable name in my mouth and the absurd conviction that if I spoke it too loudly, the sea would answer with weather. These are the thoughts you don't confess in bright rooms. They deserve the honest darkness of a corridor or the inside of your chest. By afternoon, the Polinia had sutured itself behind us, an eyelid closing. The sea resumed its old register of threats and lullabies. Rojas allowed herself a single sentence of belief. There was land where no one says there is. Then, as if a weight had rolled from one side of her mind to the other, she added, "But the land didn't want to be there long." The crew moved with the fast, careful economy of those who trust the world less, after they've seen it show a new face. I tried to help coil lines and made a mess of it. My hands were better with paper than rope. In my cabin, I finally remembered the chemist's envelope. It had thinned my pocket all morning like an unanswered question. I set it on the table and waited, as if it might open itself when it judged me ready. The coin in my other pocket had cooled back to ordinary metal, but the island's warmth remained in my fingertips, in defiance of physics. I turned the envelope over and traced the seam with a thumbnail. Some messages must be read at the place they're meant for. We had been there. Does the message know? Does it care? Before opening it, I tried the old trick of analysis as prayer. I listed what I knew. A palimpsest with beneath ink bearings all converging on a mouth in the ice. Seabed forms echoing a crescent pattern. Steps too regular to be accidents. Stones carved with symbols that matched the hidden warning marks. Birds whose arcs traced those same curves. And a name, older than my memory, and somehow inside it. On another page, I listed the parts that frightened me. That the stones felt warm, that the wind had fallen silent when I reached the shelf. That island rose and then sank as if timed to our arrival. That the first word had waited for centuries and had chosen my breath to say it. I drew a line between the lists and could not tell which side weighed more. The ship's bell rang for the change of watch, a human rhythm reasserting itself against the ocean's endless measure. I slid a finger under the envelope's flap. Paper rasped like sand. Inside lay a single translucent sheet and a brief note in the chemist's easy hand. For oblique light. The marks are directional. The sheet bore faint, hair-thin arrows circling a printed compass rose, each arrow paired with a tiny arc and dot motif. I held it over the fragment copy. The arrows matched the bearings from the hidden layer. The arcs nested over currents I had only guessed at. The sheet was a key, not to the first word, but to the order of the words that would follow. A feeling like gratitude moved through me, complicated by the recognition that gratitude is a debt with a smile. I taped the key over the fragment, aligning arrow to arrow, and the drawing transformed. What had been a starburst became a pathway, a spiral stepping inward and eastward, not to the crescent itself, but to the solitary island the bearings seemed to worship. The second word of the sentence would be spoken there, if anywhere. But the arrows also carried small notations in the chemist's precise script. Where the wind would turn treacherous, where sound might carry too far, where the water listens. I read the phrase twice. Does water listen? It does if you do. I folded the key and the fragment together and slipped them back into oilskin. The hinges inside me clicked into a new alignment. I felt the fear sharpen, which meant it had become useful. I stepped into the passage where the hull sighed and the pipes clicked, and let the ship speak the truth of movement into my bones. Some sentences must be walked to be understood. Some must be sailed. And when I finally opened the chemist's envelope, the single page inside told me how to read the second word. It was not a page of text in the conventional sense, no narrative, no sentences to pass, yet it spoke in a structure I recognized instantly: direction, sequence, and restraint. The thin sheet bore a faint spiral, traced in ink so pale it seemed afraid of permanence, each curve marked with a small arrow, and between certain arrows, notations that felt less like instructions and more like warnings disguised as waypoints. One read, "Approach with shadow to stern." Another, "Sound travels here farther than sight." And beside the smallest loop of the spiral, the words, "If you reach this point and the wind dies, wait, I laid the key over the fragment again, aligning the spiral to the bearings, and the path revealed itself as clearly as if it had been hidden under frost. It didn't lead across open sea. It wove between submerged rises, skirting shelves and gullies like someone threading through a labyrinth designed to both guide and deter. The final loop stopped short of the solitary island shoreline, as if the mapmaker believed the last distance could not be drawn, only lived. The arcs and dots along the way took on a new logic. They marked not dangers to avoid, but thresholds to cross, each one a test or an introduction. Rojas found me bent over the table in the lab, my hands steady in a way my breath wasn't. She glanced at the overlay and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're going back." It wasn't a question. "If the lead opens again," I said, "and if the ice allows it." She shook her head, not in refusal, but in that resigned way sailors do when they know the sea's patience outlasts their own. "You're not just chasing geography anymore," she said. "You're answering something that's been calling longer than you've been alive." I couldn't deny it. The idea of calling felt dangerously accurate, like a diagnosis you don't want to be right about. That night, the Tern crept along the ice edge under a sky smeared with green aurora. Curtains of light wavered across the stars, as if the world itself were pulling signals from some deeper place. I stood alone on the aft deck, the overlay still in my pocket, and felt the ship's course change minutely. An adjustment to avoid a flow, a silent conversation between captain and helm. The subtlety of it made me think about the spiral's last loop, a change so slight it would go unnoticed unless you were already inside its rhythm. Was the second word not a place at all, but a way of moving? Sleep came late, bringing another of those unsettling dreams. I was in a narrow channel, black basalt on either side, the water so still it reflected the sky in perfect symmetry. Ahead, a figure stood on the solitary island's shore. Not man, not entirely shadow, but something assembled from patience and attention. It raised a hand, and the wind behind me stopped. Not slackened, stopped. The sea's skin became glass, and in that silence I understood. The absence of wind was not a delay, but an opening, an invitation to step onto land that would otherwise reject you. I woke with the taste of salt and the faint impression of that four-syllable name pressed against my tongue like a seal. The next day brought a brief break in the weather, and Rojas announced we'd turn east to work along the ice margin. It would put us nearer to where the spiral's path began, though not inside it yet. I said nothing to the crew, but every part of me leaned toward that imagined entrance, like a needle seeking true north. I spent the hours studying the sounder's returns, watching for the first hint of the submerged rises that matched the overlay. Once or twice, I thought I saw them, a slow lifting of the seabed into patterns too regular for accident. But the data was fragmentary, as if the instruments themselves were reluctant to name what they'd touched. By evening we drifted near a tongue of open water that extended like a dark invitation between flows. It wasn't the Polinia from before, but its edges were just as clean, its surface just as calm. I felt the overlay burn in my pocket, though it was only paper. Rojas joined me at the rail, her face unreadable in the half-light. "You have that look again," she said, "the one people get when they've already decided the answer is worth the cost." I didn't answer. The aurora shimmered faintly overhead, its green veils folding and unfolding like a hand gesturing toward the horizon. Below us, the water gave a single, deep sound, a resonance that vibrated through the hull and into my bones. I recognized it instantly, the same hollow timbre I'd heard when my boot first touched the basalt steps. It was as if something under the surface had knocked back. The crew felt it too. A few looked over their shoulders toward the bow, as though expecting to see a presence there. Rojas's eyes found mine. "The ice will move tonight," she said, almost to herself. I went below and spread the overlay once more, tracing the spiral, till my hand slowed over that last incomplete loop. The chemist's note beside, If you reach this point and the wind dies, wait. Looked different now, less like advice and more like a condition of entry. I could feel the sentence forming, its first word the basalt steps, its second hidden behind whatever lay on that solitary shore, and if a sentence has 2 words, it almost certainly has more. That thought kept me awake, listening to the ice grind and the water answer, and somewhere in the space between those sounds, I realised that once I set foot on that island, the map would stop being a guide. It would become something else entirely, something that might not let me leave. The thought was not a warning so much as a condition, like the air thinning at altitude or the way light behaves underwater. You don't fight it, you adapt, or you turn back. But turning back had stopped being a choice sometime between the basalt steps and the chemist's envelope. I felt the decision in my body the way you feel an old injury in the rain. The map had led me to its first word. Now it was asking me to pronounce the second, and the price would be to walk into a place where its rules replaced mine. The Tern moved like she was listening. Her engines hummed low, conserving motion, her bow nosing into thin seams of open water between flows. The night sky was crowded with a thin mist that blurred the aurora into smears of pale green, as if the light itself had been brushed by wind. I kept the overlay close, folded in oilskin, and every few hours I checked the bearings against our slow drift. The spiral's outer loops were near now. Too near. At dawn, the sounder began returning shapes I recognised. The first of the submerged rises, low humps beneath the surface, their slopes too smooth to be glacial debris. A deckhand leaned over the rail and remarked that the water had that listening feel again, and I saw the fine hairs on his wrist standing up. By mid-morning the wind slackened to a bare sigh. The chemist's note replayed in my mind. If you reach this point and the wind dies, wait. Rojas gave me a look from the helm, a silent acknowledgement that we were standing at the threshold. The flows here moved strangely, not in the random jostle of ice at liberty, but in slow, circling patterns, as though drawn into the geometry of the spiral itself. We dropped speed and let the current carry us along one of the bearings. I felt the pressure of the path as surely as if it had been walled. We were inside something's design. By afternoon, the fog began to gather. Not the loose, ragged fog of open sea, but a denser kind, layered and patient. Visibility fell until the water ahead of the bow looked like poured slate. The crew moved quieter now, footsteps muffled, voices lowered without instruction. Even the birds had thinned out, leaving only a few dark silhouettes gliding in the haze. One passed low over the deck, and I caught the glint of that bright thread on its leg again, frayed now, as if it had been worn for longer than a bird's life should allow. When the solitary island appeared, it did not rise from the water like the basalt shelf had. It was simply there, as though the fog had been holding it in its hands and finally parted its fingers. Its shore was narrow, a strip of dark stone, and above it the slope rose in terraces, less like natural land and more like the work of someone who had shaped earth the way others shape clay. At its crown stood a single column, broken halfway, its upper half lying along the ground as if felled by a deliberate push. Even from the deck I could see it was carved with the same arc and dot symbols. The wind died completely as we anchored in the lee of the stone shore. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the air itself had been drained of motion. I looked at Rojas, expecting her to order the engines kept warm for a quick escape, but she only said, "You have one tide." Her voice carried an edge of finality, not threat, but certainty. I took the launch again, alone this time, the water so still it felt like sliding over glass. Each pull of the oars seemed to echo back to me from under the hull, a hollow resonance that matched the steps from before. As I drew closer, I saw that the shore was littered with more of the carved stones, some half buried in silt, others arranged in arcs that mirrored the island's curve. The column's fallen half lay with its carved face turned upward, each groove filled with wind-blown grit that had settled into the shapes like letters inked in pale sand. Stepping onto the shore was like stepping onto a held breath. The cold here was different, not sharper but deeper, as if it lived under the skin instead of on it. My boots sank slightly into the damp grit, and I realised the beach was made not of sand, but of ground stone, crushed fine and light enough to drift in the air when disturbed. I knelt by one of the arcs of stones and touched the nearest carving. Warm again, though the sun had not touched this place all day. The slope beckoned upward, the terraces like invitations. Each step higher revealed more of the spiral's design, paths etched faintly into the earth, guiding me toward the broken column. When I reached it, I placed my hand on the carved surface, and for the first time since finding the hidden coastline in the map, I felt something push back. Not physically, not in muscle or bone, but in the marrow's memory, like the press of a palm against mine from the inside. I don't remember speaking, but the name was suddenly in the air between the column and me, whole and resonant. The wind returned in that instant, rushing up the terraces and through the broken stone like a voice freed from a long silence. And beneath that voice, a deeper sound, low and steady, like the sea answering from beneath the island's foundations. I stood there, knowing without doubt I had spoken the second word of the sentence, and something had heard me. The recognition moved through me, not like triumph, but like the slow tide that creeps up the shore without you realising until your boots are wet. The island felt altered now, though I suspected the change was in me. The terraces no longer seemed like ruins. They were in use, just by something I could not see. The wind, which had been absent, now moved in deliberate currents, curling along the carved lines as though tracing them with invisible fingers. I stood beside the fallen half of the column, my palm still resting against the groove where I'd spoken the name, and listened. The sea below was not the same sea I had crossed to get here. Its voice carried a new depth, a cadence that matched the hollow knocks I'd heard through the hull of the Tern. I thought of the chemist's note. The marks are directional. It seemed absurd now to think of them merely as navigational aids. They were invitations, or perhaps permissions, marking not just where to go, but when to speak. My eyes followed the arc of the shore to the northern edge of the island, where the slope fell steeply into dark water. There, at the limit of sight, I thought I saw another shape beneath the surface, long, low, and parallel to the beach, as if a wall or a causeway lay drowned. The birds that had shadowed us before reappeared, circling low over that place, their wings skimming the water in unison before breaking apart again. It was a kind of choreography, and the sight of it made something in my chest tighten, like hearing a song you almost remember. I began walking down from the column, following the terraces as they spiralled toward the shore. The path was narrow, worn into the stone as if by countless feet, though whose feet I couldn't guess. Every so often a carved stone jutted from the slope, each marked with its arc and dot. Some were freshly cleared of debris, others half buried, but all faced the same way, toward the north, toward that shadow in the water. At the base of the slope, I found a hollow shielded from the wind, where the ground dipped into a bowl of smoothed rock. Inside lay fragments, shards of worked stone, splinters of something metallic and green with age, and, most curious of all, a single disc the size of my palm, made from the same dark basalt as the steps. It was unmarked, except for a shallow depression in the centre, perfectly circular. I turned it over in my hands, and the wind shifted again, gusting from the north as if to push me toward the water. I followed the shore until I reached the edge where the slope met the sea. The water was impossibly clear, the kind of clarity you only find in cold places where nothing stirs the sediment. Beneath the surface, the shadow resolved into stone, blocks fitted together with precision, the seams so fine they could have been cut yesterday. The structure ran straight out from the island into the deep, vanishing into the blue. It was not random, it was a road. The thought lodged in me like a splinter. The road went somewhere, and the name I had spoken might have been less a word and more a key. I felt the pull of it, not metaphorical, but a pressure in the sternum, a subtle tilt of my balance toward the water. It was the same sensation I'd had when first looking at the map in the palace, that sense of being already halfway inside a place I had not yet reached. Behind me, the wind dropped once more, and with it, the faint sound of the sea dulled, as though someone had put a hand over its mouth. The absence was thick, expectant. I looked back toward the turn barely visible through the haze and wondered how long Roas would wait before recalling me. That was when I noticed the disc in my hand had warmed, not gradually but suddenly, as if in answer to some silent signal. I crouched by the water's edge, holding the disc just above the surface. The warmth pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Then, without deciding, I let it slip from my fingers. It sank without a bubble or ripple, vanishing into the line of the road below. For a moment, nothing. Then the water over the first few metres of the causeway began to shimmer, as though heated from beneath, though the cold still stung my face. The shimmer spread outward along the stone path, pulling my gaze farther into the deep until the shape of an archway, massive, submerged, began to emerge in the dim light. The wind rose again, sharp and insistent, snapping me out of my trance. Somewhere in that sound was the echo of my own voice speaking the name, stretched and altered until it no longer belonged to me. The sea answered with a single deep note, the kind that lingers in your bones long after it fades from the air. I took one step back from the water, then another, knowing the tide was turning and my time on the island was slipping away. But the shimmer on the causeway did not fade. Whatever I had awakened was still moving beneath the surface, patient and deliberate. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity. The second word was not the end of the sentence. It was the invitation to hear the third. That realization didn't arrive with triumph. It came with the weight of a sealed door. I could feel it ahead of me, massive and unmoving, as if my speaking of the second word had made the next threshold real. Behind me, the fog swirled like something listening, its curls and eddies shaping themselves into spirals before dissolving again. I knew without needing proof that whatever lay beyond the arch under the water was older than the island, older than the basalt steps, older even than the map's first draft. I forced myself to turn from the shimmering causeway. The road into the deep was not going anywhere quickly, but the tide was. Each retreating step up the beach left my boots marked with damp crescents in the ground stone. As I reached the terraces, the wind returned in short, deliberate gusts, almost herding me back toward the launch. When I glanced over my shoulder, the shimmer on the causeway was fading, as if the water had grown tired of holding it for my eyes. From the top of the slope, I could see the turn more clearly now, a dark, waiting shape at the edge of the haze. The thought of returning felt like stepping out of a dream, necessary, but vaguely treacherous, as though I were abandoning something mid-sentence. The broken column stood behind me, the grooves in its surface catching the late light in a way that made the symbols look newly carved. I resisted the urge to touch it again. Once you speak a word, you cannot take it back, and this one had already echoed farther than I could follow. By the time I pushed the launch off the shore, the air had thickened with fine crystals that stung my cheeks. The water was so still that each pull of the oars left rings expanding far longer than they should have. Halfway to the turn, I looked down and saw the road again, faint now, a suggestion of lines in the blue. At the very edge of my vision, the arch still waited. It didn't fade. Rojas met me at the rail, her eyes narrowing as she searched my face. She didn't ask what I'd seen. She could read it in the tension I carried. Instead, she said, "We're moving." Ice is closing from the east. Her voice was brisk, but I caught the faintest trace of something else beneath it. Not fear, anticipation. Once underway, I went below and spread my notes, trying to fix the causeway's measurements before they blurred into memory. But my mind kept circling back to the chemist's spiral, the arrows marking currents and thresholds. There had been no mention of a third word on the overlay, yet the design felt incomplete without it. It was as though the map had been waiting for me to discover that not all of its instructions were written in ink. That night, sleep found me in sudden bursts. I dreamed of the arch as if I stood before it underwater. The basalt slick with the movement of unseen currents. Symbols, arc and dot, marched along its lintel, and at the centre a circle the size of my palm, empty but for the deep. When I woke I could still feel the cold pressing against my skin, as if I had leaned my face into it. In the morning the ice pressed closer, but so did something else, a change in the water's tone. The Tern's hull carried the sound like a low chord, not unlike the deep note I'd heard on the island shore. It seemed to follow us, resonating differently when the ship passed over certain depths. I found myself standing at the rail, scanning the grey horizon, certain that somewhere behind us the road continued. The crew moved faster now, coiling lines, securing deck gear. Rojas stood at the bow, her hands in her pockets, the set of her shoulders telling me she was weighing whether to risk another approach when the ice shifted again. "If you had one more day," she said without turning him, "would you go back?" I didn't answer immediately. The truth was heavy in my mouth. Yes, without hesitation. But going. Back without knowing what the third word was would be like stepping onto the basalt steps without knowing where they led. I thought of the disc I'd dropped into the water, how it had sunk straight into the road's centre line as though guided. If there was a key for the third word, it was somewhere beyond that arch. The wind picked up, cutting a clean edge through the fog. The ice ahead of us parted slightly, opening a narrow lead, a passage that didn't exist on our charts. Rojas glanced over her shoulder at me. She didn't need to speak. The offer was in her eyes. One more chance before the ice closed again. My hand went to my pocket, where the coin rested cool now, almost calm. The sentence the map had been writing was not finished, and I was already too deep inside it to pretend I could walk away. "I'd go back," I said finally, the words more to myself than to her, and the moment I spoke them, the wind shifted, as though it had been waiting for my answer. The change was subtle, but on the turn even subtlety had weight. The air felt sharper, tuned, as if it had shed all its casual motion and now moved with intent. Rojas didn't smile, but her head dipped in acknowledgement, the smallest of nods that still managed to feel like a contract. The lead ahead of us was narrow, barely wide enough for the hull, and bordered by floes that glistened under the grey light like the edges of an unopened letter. The crew moved without chatter, their boots thudding softly against the deck, their breaths fogging into brief ghost-like shapes. I stood at the bow, the coin cold against my palm, watching the line of dark water twist eastward, exactly toward where the spiral's bearings had pointed all along. Crossing into that lead was like entering a corridor with walls of ice instead of stone. The sound changed immediately. Gone was the broad hush of open water. Here every creak of the hull and slap of the swell echoed back at us from ice faces that seemed to lean in. It was not the echo of emptiness, but of something listening. My thoughts returned to the chemist's note. Sound travels here farther than sight. I found myself lowering my voice without realizing it. After an hour, the lead widened just enough to reveal a dark smudge on the horizon. At first I thought it was another floe, but its edges were too precise. As we closed the distance, the smudge became a line, and then a silhouette, a low wall running parallel to the water's surface. My stomach tightened. It was the causeway, or part of it, exposed above the tide. The basalt was slick, sheened with ice, but the seams between its blocks were as clean and straight as the day they were laid. Rojas cut the engines to idle. The Tern drifted closer, her momentum carrying us over the submerged section where I dropped the basalt disc. I felt it before I saw it, the faint vibration underfoot like the pulse of an enormous distant engine. And then the shimmer began again, crawling along the stones from the point beneath our keel toward the arch that waited in the deeper water. It emerged slowly, black and exact, its lintel still patterned with the arc and dot carvings. Even from here I could see the perfect circle at its centre, empty and impossibly dark. I leaned over the rail, and the cold radiating from it cut through the ship's steel like breath through thin cloth. The crew whispered to each other, though their words were snatched away by the wind. "We can't take the turn any closer," Oha said, appearing beside me. "Ice is moving in from the west." She didn't tell me not to go. She only met my eyes and waited. The launch was already swinging in its cradle, the decision made before either of us voiced it. The water here was a strange blue-black, its surface strangely untroubled by the ice closing around us. As I rowed toward the arch, the shimmer intensified, bending the light so that the stones beneath looked as if they were floating above their own reflections. Every pull of the oars brought the circle in the arch's centre into sharper focus. It wasn't just empty. It seemed to swallow the light around it, as though depth itself had gathered there. Halfway there I heard it, the same deep note that had resonated through the island's shore, now fuller, layered with other tones like a chord struck on some enormous instrument. The sound vibrated through the water into the hull of the launch and up into my ribs. I paused, letting the oars rest in their locks. The note didn't fade. It held, steady and patient, waiting for something. I knew, without any chain of reasoning, that this was the threshold the second word had prepared me for. The third word wasn't on any map. It wasn't even something I could carry away if I learned it. It had to be spoken here, into this space where the road met the deep. My hand went to the coin again, and I realised it had warmed in my pocket, not gradually, but with sudden intent, like the basalt disc before it. The arch loomed above me now, close enough to see the fine chisel marks in its carvings. The perfect circle was no longer perfectly black. Faint ripples of light moved across it, the same shimmer that had run along the causeway. I felt my mouth open, the syllables of the four-syllable name arranging themselves in my throat unbidden, but this time something inside me resisted. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the recognition that once I spoke, the map sentence would no longer be mine to read at leisure. A shadow passed beneath the launch, large enough to tilt me in its wake. The water stilled again, and in that silence I thought I heard another voice, low, older than the stone, speaking in a rhythm that matched the current swirling between the arch's pillars. It didn't sound hostile. It sounded expectant. The ice was closing fast. I could see the pressure ridges forming in the distance. Rojas' voice carried faintly from the turn, but her words were lost to the wind. I took one last look at the circle, its depth pulling at my gaze, and let the name rise, steady now, clear and deliberate. The moment the last syllable left my mouth, the water within the arch began to move, not with tide, but with purpose. And beyond that moving water, shapes began to form. At first they were no more than distortions, shimmers folding over shimmers, as if the water itself were trying to remember something it had been before. Then slowly the currents organised into outlines. Stone first, unmistakable in its weight, its edges honed rather than eroded. Arches within arches, vanishing in procession into the dark beyond. Between them, columns rose like sentinels, each carved with the same arc and dot language, repeating into distance until they blurred into the depths. But the shapes weren't all stone. Between the columns moved silhouettes that didn't bend to the sway of water. They glided with too much intent, their forms smooth and narrow, the kind of shapes the mind struggles to measure because it's too busy deciding whether they belong to something alive. My grip on the oars tightened. These figures kept their distance from the threshold, as though the arch was a border neither they nor I could cross without invitation. The deep chord still thrummed through the hull, but now it was layered with another tone. Higher, more intricate, like the flicker of light turned into sound. It came in intervals, each burst of resonance answered by the figures in the water shifting position, as if they were rearranging themselves in response. I realised, with the kind of clarity that only arrives once in a lifetime, that the third word wasn't meant for me alone. It was a signal. Behind me, the ice cracked sharply, a reminder that the lead wouldn't stay open forever. The wind was shifting again, tugging at the launch, urging me to turn back. But the pull from the arch was stronger, a silent persuasion that felt less like compulsion, and more like the kind of inevitability you accept only because you've already stepped too far to undo it. I drew the oars in and let the launch drift closer until the bow kissed the shimmer where the causeway met the arch. The temperature dropped so fast my breath turned white and hung in front of my face like a veil. Beneath me, one of the shapes glided forward, closer than any had dared before. Its outline broke the surface for a moment, a curve like the back of some ancient sea creature, dark and unpolished, scattering droplets that steamed against the freezing air. The chord deepened, and the stone of the arch seemed to tremble. A faint light began to seep from the carvings, tracing the arcs and dots in pale gold that bled into the water. The light didn't illuminate like a lantern. It defined, sharpening the edges of the threshold until I could see that the circle at its centre was not flat at all. It was a tunnel, and in that tunnel the water didn't behave like water. It hung there, slow and deliberate, as if the rules of motion had been written differently inside. The figures in the depths moved again, aligning themselves into a formation that mirrored the spiral on the chemist's overlay. It was no accident. They were the spiral. The path I'd followed across the map, through the ice onto the basalt steps, up the terraces, down to the causeway, everything had been a rehearsal for this arrangement. I thought of the first word on the steps, the second on the island's column. The third was here, coiled inside the formation, waiting to be spoken not to the air or stone, but into that altered water. I leaned forward, the bow dipping slightly. The wind fell away in the same suddenness I'd felt on the solitary island. A stillness took hold, vast and total, and I knew the moment had arrived. My mouth formed the name again, but with the subtle inflection the dream had taught me. The pause, the upward tone on the second syllable. The sound left me and moved into the circle, not dispersing like words in open air, but sinking, absorbed. The reaction was immediate. The spiral of figures turned inward, the water inside the arch folding upon itself like a page closing. The pale gold from the carvings flared once, blinding, and then dimmed into a steady glow. Something vast shifted beyond the threshold, too large to see in entirety, but its presence pressed against my perception like the weight of a continent. From that presence came a single pulse of thought, not in words, but in a sensation I understood without translation. Continue. It wasn't request or command. It was simple fact. The sentence was longer still. The ice groaned again, closer now. I backed the launch away, the shimmer fading behind me, though the glow in the carvings remained, as if the arch had been lit from within for the first time in centuries. The figures did not follow, but they did not retreat either. They watched, holding their formation, keeping the spiral intact. By the time I reached the Tiern, Rojas had the engines warm. She studied my face once more, and this time, though she asked nothing, I answered anyway. It's not finished. Her jaw tightened, but she nodded, turning the ship toward open water. And as the arch sank back into haze, I felt the third word settle inside me, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a question I already knew I would risk everything to answer. That question lived in my chest for the next 2 days, a low, persistent ache, like the ghost of a bruise that wouldn't fade. The turn pushed north through narrow leads, dodging ice floes that closed like jaws behind us. Rojas avoided asking the obvious, but I caught her watching me in the chart room, in the mess, on deck. She knew I wasn't done. Maybe she wasn't either. The third word was unlike the first two. Those had been discoveries, found, spoken, and then left to echo into the world. This one was a tether. Wherever I went, I could feel its pull, stretching behind me like an unbroken thread that ran under ice, under water, and into whatever lay beyond that threshold. It didn't demand, it didn't plead. It simply existed, unignorable, like gravity. I tried to occupy myself with the map again, spreading my copies and notes across the chart table, tracing the spiral's arcs with a pencil until they blurred into muscle memory. The centre point, the place the spiral converged, wasn't where the arch had been. It was farther south, on the edge of a shelf that no ship could cross without risking being crushed by shifting pack ice. Yet the more I studied it, the more I realised the arch was only an outer gate. The true centre was still hidden. That night, I dreamed again of the altered water, but this time, I wasn't in the launch or standing on the causeway. I was beneath the arch, looking back toward the world I'd come from. In the dream, the sea above me was a sheet of hammered silver, and the light didn't behave like sunlight. It pulsed like breath. The spiral of figures moved around me in silence, their faces unreadable, their bodies casting no shadows. In the centre of the circle, a column of light fell through the water like a rope, stretching into a darkness I couldn't see the bottom of. I knew, without question, that following it would lead to the sentence's next word. I woke with that certainty lodged in my ribs. The air in my cabin was cold enough to mist with each breath. My hands were clenched so tightly the skin across my knuckles burned. I didn't need to look at the map. The path was already etched into me. By mid-morning the ice thickened. Rojas stood at the wheelhouse, scanning the pressure ridges forming ahead. "We'll need to skirt east," she said, though her tone held the weight of something unspoken. I joined her, and after a long silence I said, "There's a way in. It's just not on the surface." Her eyes flicked toward me. "You're thinking under the shelf." I nodded. The arch wasn't the end. It was the start. There's another structure deeper, closer to the centre. The currents at the arch were too organised to be random. They're leading somewhere. She didn't answer immediately, and I could hear the ice groaning outside like a giant exhaling under strain. Finally she said, "If we take the turn in, we won't get her back out before winter closes in. You know that." "I'm not saying we take her," I said. "Just me, and anyone willing to follow." Her gaze held mine a moment longer before she turned back to the ice. "You'd need more than the launch, more than luck." Luck, I thought, was never part of it. The map hadn't led me this far to abandon me at the edge. The third word wasn't just a signal. It was an agreement, and I had accepted without realising it. That night the sea around us calmed in a way that made my skin crawl. The swell flattened, the wind dropped, and even the ice seemed to hold its breath. I went on deck and saw faint glows in the water off the port side. Pale gold, tracing curves that matched the spiral's pattern. They weren't far, just beneath the surface, drifting north alongside us as if escorting the turn. By morning they were gone, but I knew what they meant. The spiral was moving with me now, matching my course, waiting for me to turn toward the centre. When I returned to the chart table, the decision was already made in my hands before it reached my thoughts. I traced a line from our position to the point south of the shelf, the point the spiral had guarded all along. I felt the third word stir inside me again, resonating faintly against my ribs, and in that quiet vibration I heard the message as clearly as if someone had whispered it. It's time to continue the sentence. Those words didn't feel like something I'd merely heard. They felt placed inside me, settled into my bones the way certain truths do. Outside the wheelhouse windows the world looked unchanged. Pale sky, fractured ice, the slow shiver of open leads. But beneath it all, a line had been drawn, and I could no longer imagine stepping away from it. I told Rojas before breakfast. She didn't answer right away, only set her coffee down and looked at me in the way you look at someone who's already chosen a dangerous road. "You're not going to let this go," she said at last. "I can't," I replied. "Whatever's at the centre, it's why the map exists. The arch was only to make sure we could follow the path. Now it's calling us in." Her eyes flicked to the chart pinned beside the table. "Under the shelf?" "Yes." We spent the next hours in quiet preparation, though neither of us used that word aloud. Supplies were checked and rechecked, not because we were being meticulous, but because any mistake here would be final. The launch wasn't built for deep submersion, so we'd be taking the turn as far as she could manage before ice made it impossible, then transferring to the smaller craft fitted with reinforced plating and a sealed canopy. It had been meant for survey work, not for whatever waited beyond the spiral's last turn, but it was all we had. By mid-afternoon, the weather began to turn. Fine snow sifted from a sky without clouds, drifting sideways across the deck like powdered glass. The air had that particular weight it gets before a shift, as though the atmosphere itself was thickening. Standing on the bow, I could almost sense the spiral beneath us, threading its way under ice and current, aligning itself with our heading. That night, my dreams were filled with corridors. Not stone this time, but water, walls and ceilings made of it, moving and yet holding shape, as if bound by invisible frames. The figures from the arch followed at a distance, never closer than a dozen paces, their eyes dark and depthless. At the dream's end, the corridor opened into an impossible space, a chamber the size of a city suspended in the deep, lit only by gold patterns running along its inner walls. At the centre was something round, massive and turning. I woke with the image fixed behind my eyes like an after-image from staring at the sun. We reached the edge of the shelf just after dawn. The ice here was older, thicker, the colour of old glass. In places it rose into ridges that cast shadows like cliffs. The turn slowed, her engines humming low, careful. We found a narrow lead running south, too tight for the ship but wide enough for the smaller craft. Plan was simple. Rojas and I would take her down along the slope of the shelf until we found an opening deep enough to follow the spiral's line toward the centre. As we lowered the submersible into the water, the sea had an unnatural stillness. Not the calm of good weather, but the kind that feels staged, like an actor holding perfectly still before their cue. I climbed into the canopy and felt the air close around me, thin and metallic with the smell of the seals. Rojas took the controls without a word, and we began our descent. The water turned from pale green to deep blue, then to black threaded with faint ribbons of light. At first I thought they were bioluminescent plankton, but their lines were too deliberate. They curved ahead of us, always just far enough to stay beyond the reach of the sub's lights, guiding us downward. When we passed the 100-metre mark, the pressure creaked along the hull. The ribbons of light grew thicker, weaving together into a pattern unmistakably like the spiral, though here it was three-dimensional, wrapping around us in a slow rotation. I reached out and touched the canopy. "We're inside it," I said, barely above a whisper. Rojas didn't look at me. "Then we'd better be ready for whatever's at the centre." The spiral tightened around us, the light intensifying until it no longer seemed to come from any one point. It was the water itself, glowing faintly, alive with movement. Somewhere ahead, the black deepened again, not with shadow, but with the suggestion of a vast opening. And in that darkness, I felt the third word shift inside me, aligning itself with something unseen, as though readying to meet whatever waited there. The sensation was almost physical, a faint tightening in my chest, like a drawn bowstring waiting for release. The deeper we went, the more the water seemed to press in from all directions, not with crushing weight, but with an odd, anticipatory stillness. Even the hum of the submersible systems seemed muffled, as if the very sound was being absorbed into the black ahead. The spiral of light thinned as we descended into the vast opening. It was like crossing the threshold of a cathedral after walking a narrow alley. The sudden expansion of space was dizzying. Shapes emerged in the dim glow, columns thicker than any tree, trunk rising into darkness, their surfaces covered in the same arc and dot patterns I'd seen on the arch. But here the marks were worn, not by time, but by movement, as though countless hands or currents had brushed against them for centuries. Rojas adjusted the thrusters to keep us steady, her hands firm but slow. "We're not in open water anymore," she murmured, her voice almost reverent. "This is enclosed." She was right. The water ahead wasn't drifting freely. It moved with a kind of order, flowing along invisible lanes that bent around the columns. Some paths were dark, others faintly luminous. The effect was hypnotic, and for a moment I felt as if the sub was drifting in a current of thought rather than tide. Then, from between two columns, a shadow emerged. It was large enough to block our forward lights for several seconds, moving with a deliberation that made my pulse quicken. I couldn't tell if it was a single entity or several moving in perfect formation. Its edges shimmered, not with the pale gold I'd seen before, but with a deeper coppery hue. The third word inside me resonated in response, a low vibration that travelled through my ribs into the seat. Whatever this thing was, it recognised the signal. The shadow paused, as if regarding us, then drifted back into the darker lanes, vanishing from sight. Only the lingering echo of that coppery shimmer marked its passing. We pressed on, following the luminous lanes deeper into the chamber. The spiral pattern was still present, but here it wasn't a guide. It was the architecture itself. The columns were arranged in great arcs, each curve drawing us inward. At the very centre of the formation, barely visible through the shifting light, was something massive and circular, rotating slowly. It was unlike any structure I'd ever seen. The surface wasn't stone. It moved, flexing slightly as if it were breathing. The glow from the lanes fed into it, strands of light sinking into its form before spilling out again in a different hue. "That's alive," Rojas said, not as a question but as a fact. I nodded, unable to speak. The third word was pulsing now, matching the rotation of the thing at the centre. I realised then that I wasn't just carrying a fragment of a sentence. I was part of it. The map, the arch, the spiral. None of them were destinations. They were clauses. This was the beginning of the next one. We brought the sub to a halt a few dozen metres from the central form. For a long moment, nothing changed. Then, a ripple passed across its surface, and an opening appeared, round, perfectly smooth, large enough for the sub to enter. I looked at Rojas. Her jaw was set, her eyes fixed on the opening. "If we go in," she said, "we may not come back the same." "Then we go in," I replied. The sub's nose tilted forward and we slid into the opening. The light outside faded instantly, replaced by a deeper, richer glow that seemed to come from all directions at once. The water here was warmer, moving with a slow pulse that felt almost like a heartbeat. As the passage curved ahead, I realised that the third word inside me had gone silent. Not gone, but waiting. Whatever lay ahead would be its answer. The glow thickened as we moved forward, not in brightness but in density, as if the water itself had become saturated with light. The walls of the passage undulated slowly, their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. Some resembled the arc and dot language from the arch, but others were unfamiliar, long flowing curves broken by sudden geometric angles, as if two entirely different minds had collaborated on the same design. The deeper we went, the more I felt a strange alignment taking place inside me. It wasn't thought, not exactly, but something older, instinctive, like an animal adjusting its steps to match the rhythm of unseen drums. The third word pulsed in time with the motion of the walls, and I realised the structure wasn't guiding us in a straight line. It was spiralling, tightening, leading us toward a point that felt impossibly far and dangerously close all at once. Rojas kept her hands steady on the controls, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "You feel that, don't you?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's sinking us." "To what?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, and because part of me feared the truth. The passage opened suddenly into a vast domed chamber. At its centre floated a sphere, massive and dark, its surface veined with molten gold lines that shifted like rivers seen from above. The lanes of light we'd followed poured into it from every direction, vanishing into the surface as if absorbed. Every few seconds the sphere exhaled, there's no other word for it, sending a gentle surge through the water that rocked the sub in place. As we drifted closer, I became aware of something pressing at the edges of my mind. Not words, not even images, just the impression of enormity, a presence so vast it couldn't fit into thought. My breath came faster, but not from fear. It was awe, the kind that left no room for anything else. Then the gold veins brightened, and for the first time the presence took form. Shapes emerged along the surface of the sphere. Figures in relief, their features impossibly detailed. Some were human, others not. Yet each face seemed to be looking directly at me, their eyes alive, as if watching not from the surface but from within. One of the human faces began to shift, its features rearranging into something I recognised with a shock. It was mine. Not as I was now, but older, lined, carrying an expression I'd never worn but somehow knew I would. The third word inside me resonated once sharply, and the surface of the sphere rippled. A voice, not sound but sensation, spoke through the vibration. The sentence is not written. You will carry the next word. I gripped the seat. What does that mean? The sphere pulsed, and the molten lines began to trace a pattern I knew by heart, the spiral from the map. Only this time, it didn't stop at the centre. It extended beyond, into shapes I had never seen before, curling outward in a new design that looked like a continuation rather than an ending. Rojas was staring at it too, her mouth slightly open. "It's not finished," she whispered. The presence pressed against us again, filling the chamber with a sensation like the intake of breath before speaking. I felt the weight of expectation, and something else, permission. And then, into the quiet, a fourth word arrived. It wasn't given in sound nor in thought, but in the same way a memory comes when you smell something from childhood. Instant, complete, undeniable. I can't write it here, because it was never a word in any language I know, but I understood it entirely. The sphere dimmed, the gold fading to a low ember. The presence retreated, though not entirely. It lingered, like a shadow just beyond the edge of light. The water in the chamber began to move, gently pushing us back toward the passage we had come through. Neither of us spoke until we were swallowed again by the spiralling tunnel, the glow behind us fading into the dark. Rojas finally said, "So, what now?" I looked ahead into the narrowing light. "Now, we follow where the new line leads." The words hung between us in the dim cabin light, their meaning both obvious and impossibly vast. We were still deep beneath the ice, surrounded by water that pulsed with the slow rhythm of something older than any map, older than the ice itself. And yet, for the first time since leaving the arch, I felt not only pulled forward, but also pushed. The current behind us had shifted. The spiral wasn't just guiding now, it was urging. Rojas kept the subs heading steady as we rose through the spiralling tunnel, the glow of the chamber fading until it was only a faint ember in the distance. My mind kept returning to the fourth word, its shape, its impossible clarity. It wasn't just a word. It was a direction disguised as meaning, a fragment of a sentence that carried its own trajectory. Even without a map, I knew exactly where it pointed. We emerged from the tunnel into open black water. Above us, faint glimmers marked where the ice filtered the pale daylight. I felt a momentary pang, the kind you get when leaving a place you know you might never see again. Whatever the sphere was, it had imprinted something inside me. I could feel it in the rhythm of my own heartbeat, slightly altered now, just enough to know it no longer belonged entirely to me. Rojas broke the silence. If that thing wanted you to have the next word, it means someone else carried the ones before it. Maybe someone carried them to the arch before us. I turned to her. And maybe someone will carry the ones after me. But it's not a relay. It's a sentence. Every word changes the meaning of the ones before. We angled the sub upward, toward the underside of the ice shelf. But instead of turning back toward the turn, I gave her the new coordinates, farther east, toward a trench I'd seen marked faintly on old seismic charts. It was in the same general direction the fourth word had pointed, and I had no doubt it was next. The ice above grew thicker as we travelled, blotting out what little light filtered down. Our own beams cut narrow corridors through the black, catching occasional flashes of life. Strange pale creatures drifting just out of reach, some with eyes that reflected our light like mirrors, others with no eyes at all. It was a reminder that this world had its own inhabitants, and they were not bound by the same rules of presence and absence we understood. Hours passed in steady silence, the hum of the sub-systems becoming almost meditative. I found my thoughts drifting back to the sphere's faces, especially my own, the older version of me, the one I hadn't yet become. That gaze had been neither warning nor approval, it had been recognition. We reached the edge of the trench just as the sub's instruments began to pick up a faint rhythmic pulse in the water. Not sound exactly, more like a fluctuation in density, as though something massive far below was breathing in time with the current. The sensation was familiar, but fainter than in the chamber, as if whatever made it was deeper still. Rojas studied the readings. We drop here, we may not have enough power to climb back without shedding weight. I looked at the trench yawning beneath us, a slash of darkness so complete it seemed to erase even the water around it. Then we drop, I said. We descended. The walls of the trench closed in quickly, their surfaces jagged with fractures that caught the light like shards of obsidian. Every so often, I thought I saw movement within those cracks, a slow withdrawing, as though the rock itself was breathing us in. At 400 metres, the pulse grew stronger. The water warmed fractionally, and threads of pale gold light began to snake along the walls, twisting downward into the depths. I realised they were identical to the lanes that had led us into the spiral, only these were tighter, more erratic, as if something had disturbed them. The deeper we went, the more the fourth word inside me seemed to sharpen, aligning itself with something unseen. It wasn't the same pull as before, it was more like anticipation, the feeling you get standing outside a door you know is about to open. We dropped past 600 metres, and the gold threads converged into a single line that vanished into a fissure in the trench wall. It was just wide enough for the sub to pass through. Rojas glanced at me once, then steered us in. The fissure swallowed us, and for a moment the darkness was total. Then the light returned, but not the pale gold of the spiral. This was red, deep and liquid, as though the water itself had been steeped in something ancient. And somewhere ahead, in that crimson glow, I sensed the fourth word beginning to change. The shift was subtle at first, less a transformation, and more a deepening, as though the word I carried was submerging into another layer of meaning. It was unsettling, like watching a familiar coastline sink beneath a rising tide. The red light wasn't uniform. It pulsed, fading and swelling in a rhythm that didn't match the water's movement or the sub's mechanical hum. The fissure narrowed, its jagged walls pressing closer until I could almost imagine them scraping along the hull. Tiny motes drifted past the canopy, each glowing faintly red, dissolving when they touched the glass. They reminded me of embers, but these didn't fade. They vanished like they'd been swallowed. Rojas slowed our speed, her hands tight on the controls. "This place feels wrong," she said quietly. "It feels awake," I replied. The glow intensified as the fissure curved downward. Ahead, the passage widened abruptly, opening into a cavern unlike anything we'd seen so far. The walls were layered, each stratum marked by a different shade of the red, from rust brown to almost scarlet, like the inside of a geode carved from ancient bloodstone. At the chamber's centre hung a shape that at first seemed amorphous, but the longer I stared, the more I saw its symmetry. It was spherical, like the great black presence we'd met before, but fractured. Its surface split into hundreds of irregular plates, each edged in a soft crimson glow. They shifted slowly, sliding over and under one another, as if the sphere were continuously rearranging itself. From the cracks between the plates, thin streams of darker red light bled outward into the water, curling into slow spirals before dissipating. The fourth word inside me pulsed sharply, almost painfully, as though reacting to the sphere's movements. I felt heat in my chest, faint at first but growing, spreading along my ribs. It wasn't a burn, it was more like something was etching itself into me. Then the sphere stopped moving. Every plate froze in place, and the streams of red light halted mid-spiral. The stillness was so sudden it made my breath catch. From somewhere deep within the sphere, a low vibration began, so deep it was more felt than heard. The fissures of red light along its plates brightened, and one by one the plates began to rotate inward, revealing a hollow core. Inside, suspended in the centre, was an object I could barely comprehend. A perfectly clear, crystalline structure shaped like a tetrahedron, but with edges that bent subtly, defying straight geometry. It spun slowly, casting faint reflections across the crimson-lit walls. The moment I saw it, the fourth word inside me completed its change, and what emerged wasn't a new word. It was two, fused inseparably, a pairing that altered the trajectory of the sentence entirely. I understood in a flash that the meaning I'd been carrying had been incomplete until now. This was the correction, the realignment. I felt my pulse accelerate, matching the slow spin of the tetrahedron. Every time it rotated, a faint whisper passed through the water, not in any language I knew, but in a cadence I recognized from the gold lane spiral. Rojas stared at it, eyes wide. That thing, it's not just showing us something, it's reading us. The moment she spoke, the tetrahedron's spin quickened. Its edges blurred, and light, paler now, almost white, poured from its centre. The glow filled the chamber, washing over the fractured plates of the outer sphere, over the layered red walls, over us. And then, in that light, I saw it again. The older version of myself. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another figure, its features hidden in shadow, its posture familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. The image faded, the sphere's plate sliding back into place, the light receding until only the slow, crimson pulse remained. The tetrahedron was gone, as if it had never been. The fourth word, now doubled, settled into me with a final quiet certainty. Whatever waited beyond this cavern would not simply continue the sentence, it would test it. That thought stayed lodged in my mind as Rojas steered us toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow channel bled crimson light into the surrounding dark. The doubled fourth word seemed heavier now, not in a physical sense, but in the way a promise weighs more when you finally realise its cost. It was no longer content to rest inside me. It pressed outward, like it wanted to speak itself into the water. The channel was tight, winding between jagged ridges that scraped the sub's hull in places. The crimson glow faded as we moved, replaced by a murkier, deeper red that seemed to seep rather than shine. I kept my eyes on the forward lights, but my mind kept circling back to the figure I'd seen beside my older self in the sphere's light. It hadn't just been familiar, it had been inevitable, like a character from a story I'd forgotten I was part of. Rojas spoke without looking at me. "If this is a test, what happens if you fail it?" "I think," I said slowly, "failure means the sentence ends early, and maybe it's not just mine that ends." She didn't answer, but I caught the flicker of her eyes in the reflection, measuring my words, weighing them against her own growing unease. The channel widened into a second chamber, smaller than the last but stranger. The walls weren't solid. They were made of interlocking segments that drifted minutely, creating the illusion that the whole place was breathing. Threads of black and red light wound through the gaps, pulsing in counterpoint to each other, like two heartbeats out of sync. At the centre of the chamber was something I could barely process at first. It looked like a bridge, but it wasn't anchored to anything. Two vast arcs of a material like dark glass hung suspended in the middle of the space, their ends tapering into nothing. Between them stretched a shimmering surface, not water, not air, but something in between. The doubled fourth word inside me surged violently, and I knew this was it. The test. Not a question to answer, but a passage to cross. Rojas slowed us to a hover. "That doesn't look stable. It's not supposed to be," I said. The arcs began to hum, a deep resonant tone that made the sub's frame vibrate. The shimmering surface between them rippled outward, and shapes began to form within it, at first indistinct, then sharpening into images. I saw fragments of coastlines I didn't recognize, towers half swallowed by sand, rivers flowing backward into the sea. Each scene dissolved into the next, like we were looking at a reel of impossible memories. And then the images shifted to something more personal. I saw the arch again, but this time it wasn't under the ice. It stood in the middle of a desert, half buried in dust. The patterns on its surface were different, altered in ways that made my stomach twist. The spiral was broken. The doubled fourth word pounded inside me, insistent now, almost painful. I understood what it wanted, not in language, but in action. We had to cross. I met Rojas's eyes, full power forward. She hesitated, then pushed the thrusters. The sub moved toward the arcs, and the shimmering surface flared, sending out a wave of heat so intense it fogged the canopy for a moment. As we crossed the threshold, the world outside the sub dissolved. The walls of the chamber vanished. The water vanished. Even the hum of the engines faded into silence. All that remained was the shimmer, stretching in every direction, and the faint outline of the arcs far behind us. The doubled fourth word inside me felt utterly still, as if holding its breath. And then, ahead in the shimmer, something began to form, something massive, moving toward us with deliberate, unstoppable steps. At first it was only an outline, tall, impossibly tall, its upper half vanishing into the luminous haze above. Each step sent a ripple through the shimmer, bending light and space as though the very fabric we were suspended in had weight. The sound of its approach wasn't a sound at all, but a pressure, a tightening in the chest that made it harder to breathe the closer it came. The figure was humanoid in the vaguest sense, 2 arms, 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were long and fluid, like they were made from water held in shape by some invisible force. Where its face should have been, there was only a smooth expanse glowing faintly from within. Rojas whispered, "It's not coming for the sub." She was right. It was coming for me. The doubled fourth word inside me flared hot, almost searing, as if trying to break out. My skin prickled. and I could feel that same unnatural rhythm I'd picked up in the spiral chamber pounding in my veins. The thing stopped just short of the sub, its faceless head tilting as if it were examining me through the canopy. Without moving its limbs, it began to change. The smooth surface of its face rippled, pulling inward, forming shallow indentations that slowly became features, eyes, nose, mouth, until I was staring at my own reflection. Not the older version from before. This was me, as I was now, but hollow-eyed, pale and utterly still. It raised a hand and pressed it to the shimmer between us. Instinctively, I pressed mine against the inside of the canopy. The doubled fourth word inside me reacted violently, splitting, merging, spinning in my mind like a coin tossed endlessly in the air. I realised this was the test, to let it take the word, or to hold it. The reflection mouthed something I couldn't hear, its lips forming shapes I didn't recognise. Then its expression shifted into something close to sorrow. The shimmer around its hand began to thicken, hardening like ice forming on water. The sub's lights dimmed. Rojas's voice was sharp now. "We can pull back." "No," I said, the word tasting metallic in my mouth. "Forward." I pushed my palm harder against the glass. The doubled fourth word stopped spinning. It settled. And with that, the figure dissolved. Not all at once, but in layers, peeling away into fine threads of light that drifted backward into the shimmer until nothing remained. The brightness ahead cleared, and we could see what lay beyond, a vast dark expanse broken only by faint points of light scattered like distant stars. It wasn't water, it wasn't even space. It was something in between, and it stretched endlessly in all directions. The arcs that had been behind us were gone. The chamber was gone. We were somewhere else entirely. Rojas stared at the console. There's no depth reading, no temperature, nothing. We're off the chart. I nodded slowly. This is where the sentence leads. The sub drifted forward into the dark, the shimmer thinning until it was only a memory behind us. The points of light ahead began to move, not randomly but in slow spirals converging on something at the centre. It was faint. I could feel its pull, the way a shoreline pulls a swimmer in a strong current. I knew without doubt that whatever waited at that centre would decide whether the sentence I carried was allowed to finish, or whether it would end here, in a place without depth or time. Rojas tightened her grip on the controls. If we keep going, we might not be able to find our way back. I looked ahead at the distant glow. Then we make sure there's no need to. Rojas didn't answer, but her silence wasn't uncertainty. It was resolve. The dark ahead seemed to draw us in faster than the engines could. Account for the scattered points of light aligning themselves into patterns that reminded me of constellations, except they moved, shifting their geometry as though alive. The doubled fourth word pulsed in rhythm with them, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The sensation was strange. No longer a passenger inside me, it felt like a guide, nudging my thoughts toward a direction I couldn't see. Each pulse carried an undercurrent, a meaning that went beyond language. I had the sense that the word wasn't just part of the sentence, it was the keystone holding it together, and here, in this place, it was being judged for its integrity. We drifted further into the void until the moving lights began to orbit something massive ahead. At first it appeared like an absence, a deeper darkness within darkness, but as we drew nearer, its surface began to reveal texture, ridges, spirals, and an endless cascade of etched lines that glimmered faintly in the light of the smaller orbs circling it. It wasn't a planet. It wasn't a construct. It was both, organic and deliberate, as though grown by intent rather than assembled. I felt it before we reached it, the same way you feel the hum of a power line before you hear it. My bones resonated with the frequency, each vibration unlocking faint flashes of memory. The spiral in the ice, the black sphere, the faceless figure. They weren't separate encounters. They were all pieces of the same design. Rojas slowed the sub, but the current, or whatever passed for motion in this place, kept pulling us forward. "I don't think it wants us to stop," she murmured. "No," I said. "It doesn't." The etched lines on its surface shifted subtly, like veins under skin, reconfiguring themselves into shapes that felt familiar. I realised they were forming the first 3 words, the ones I'd carried before the doubling. Each one appeared in sequence, burning softly against the dark as if etched in light rather than carved. When the 3rd word faded, a space remained, an emptiness that could only be filled by the doubled 4th. The pulsing inside me grew intense, almost unbearable. It wanted to leap from me to embed itself into the surface ahead. But then something else stirred, a hesitation, not from the word, but from me. If I let it go, I didn't know what would remain of me. It had lived inside me long enough to become part of my thought, my memory, my identity. Letting it merge with this place might mean erasing the person I was before it found me. The surface began to draw us closer, the lines glowing brighter in anticipation. I felt the doubled 4th word lean toward release. My hands clenched involuntarily, as if holding on to something physical. Rojas looked at me sharply. "It's waiting for you. If you're going to do it, you have to do it now." I met her gaze, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes, not fear of what was ahead, but fear of what I might choose. The massive surface loomed directly before us, the gap in the sentence still open, still expectant. The doubled 4th word inside me gave one final urgent pulse. And then I understood. The test wasn't whether I could deliver it. The test was whether I could change it. I opened my mouth not to release the word as it was, but to speak it anew, to fracture it into something the sentence had never been before. The surface reacted instantly, the lines around the gap flaring in a violent cascade of light. The doubled 4th word burst from me, not in surrender, but in transformation. It wasn't a sound, and yet it rang through the void as if every point of light had become a bell struck in unison. The vibration passed through my bones, my blood, and even the thoughts I hadn't yet thought. The massive surface ahead reacted like a living thing startled awake. Its spirals convulsed, then stretched outward in geometric precision, forming patterns that shifted too fast for the eye to hold. I could feel Rojas looking at me, but I couldn't return her gaze. My entire focus was locked on the space where the word had been and on the thing it had become, because what left me was not the same as what had been inside. It was sharper, clearer, threaded with something I hadn't realised I was adding, my own defiance. The gap in the sentence flared open to receive it, but as the transformed word touched the surface, it didn't slot neatly into place. Instead, the entire construct shuddered. The lines reconfigured, collapsing and expanding in bursts, as though the structure had to recalculate its own existence around the change. The pull on the sub intensified. The console flickered, throwing fragmented readouts across the glass. Rojas gripped the controls, but the current, if that's what it was no longer external. It was inside us, inside the sub, inside every molecule, drawing us into the living architecture before us. The massive form began to open, not like a door, not like any physical mechanism, but like a concept revealing its hidden side. The spirals folded inward, peeling back to show a hollow space that was neither dark nor light, but the idea of both, somewhere a human mind could not fully resolve. And then came the sound. This time it was audible, a chorus of voices layered infinitely upon each other, speaking not in words but in shapes, in moments, in flashes of understanding. I saw ancient shorelines without ice, rivers that no longer existed, skies with constellations that never hung above our world. I saw hands, So many hands, pressing tools into wet clay, tracing maps on animal skin, carving spirals into stone that would one day lie buried under glaciers. It was them. Whoever had made the map, whoever had carved the spiral beneath the ice, whoever had whispered into my mind long before I'd even found the black sphere, they were here. Or at least echoes of them were here. The transformed word pulsed. Within the gap, and the chorus responded, its tone shifting as if in approval. Patterns spread outward from the point of contact, racing across the surface until they wrapped the entire massive form. The void around us began to brighten, not with light, but with clarity. Shapes I'd mistaken for distant stars revealed themselves as structures, vast and silent, suspended in the same space. Rojas spoke finally, her voice low. "What are we looking at?" "Not the past," I said. "Not exactly. More like the sentence as they wrote it. And now, what we've changed." Something in the hollow space ahead began to take shape, an opening into whatever lay beyond. But I felt the subtle warning embedded in the chorus. This was not an invitation to stay. It was a recognition, a closing of the loop. The transformed word had been accepted, but its acceptance came with a cost. We could not remain in the place it had remade. The pull reversed. The current became a push, and the arcs of light around the massive form spun faster, funneling us toward the opening. The structures in the distance began to fade, their clarity dissolving like morning fog. We were being sent back, not where we started, maybe not even where we belonged, but back into a world that would have to carry the sentence in its new form. I met Rojas's eyes and said the only thing that made sense. "Hold on, we're going through." The instant the words left my mouth, the push became violent. The sub lurched forward as if every force in that impossible void had decided to eject us at once. The hollow space ahead yawned wider, but it didn't look like an opening. It looked like the fabric of reality was folding away from us, revealing something that had been there all along. The light, if it was light, turned sharp, almost tactile, like a pressure against the skin. My teeth ached. The air inside the sub grew heavy, and for a heartbeat I swore I could hear my own blood moving. Rojas fought the controls, but they were meaningless now. We were riding a current made of something older than oceans, older than time's habit of flowing in one direction. As we crossed the threshold, I felt the transformed word still inside me, not lodged in my chest anymore, but humming faintly, like a radio tuned just off station. It was no longer the double it had once been. It was singular now, but different than before. Alive. And I knew that whatever had accepted it hadn't erased it from me. It had given it back, changed. The void snapped away. We were falling through water, cold enough to burn, and all at once the roar of a real ocean surrounded us. The shimmer was gone. The strange geometries were gone. Above, pale light filtered through shifting waves, and the taste of salt filled the sub. My console flickered back into comprehensible readings. Depth, pressure, temperature, though none of them made sense. We had returned, but not to where we'd been before. The ice was gone. The sonar showed no glaciers, no continental shelf where there should have been one. Instead, we hovered above a seafloor patterned with ruins. Stone walls, avenues, columns half buried in sand. They stretched in all directions, far beyond the reach of our lights. Rojas's voice cracked. "That wasn't here before?" I shook my head slowly. Maybe it was. Maybe we just couldn't see it. The structures below were too precise to be natural. Perfect angles, deliberate symmetry, and at the very centre a spiral carved into the seabed so massive it could only be seen in full from far above. It matched the one we'd found under the ice, the one in the old map, the one that had started all of this. A realisation cut through me like cold iron. The map had never been about finding a place that existed in our world. It had been about finding a way to see the world as they had. And now we could. The hum of the transformed word in my mind grew stronger as we descended, the spiral drawing us in. I could feel the faint tug of something beneath it, a pulse that matched the one I'd felt in the void. Whatever had remade the word was still connected to this place. Rojas looked over. If we go down there, we might not come back. I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about the voices in the void, about the hands carving spirals into stone, about the endless patterns shifting across that massive living surface. This wasn't just a ruin. It was an anchor, something that tied their world to ours, and if we left it untouched, the connection would fade. The map would become meaningless again. We're not here to come back, I said finally. We're here to finish it. The sub angled downward, the spiral growing larger in the viewport, each curve carved with symbols I recognised but couldn't read. The water seemed to still as we neared the centre, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. The hum inside me steadied into a single tone. I knew that once we reached the centre, it would either stop or never stop again. The spiral loomed beneath us, no longer just a carving in the seabed, but a vortex of meaning, each groove etched with the precision of a civilization that had measured not just space, but the shape of time itself. As we descended, the water seemed unnaturally still, as if the laws that governed currents and tides here had been suspended in deference to what lay below. Rojas's hands tightened on the controls. Her eyes never left the viewport, but her breathing was uneven. "If this is what I think it is," she said, "then maybe we shouldn't touch it." Her words echoed my own doubts. We had been given the transformed word, carried it back into this world, and now the spiral, this anchor, waited for its resonance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment we completed whatever this was, something irreversible would happen. The closer we drew, the clearer the carvings became. They weren't just symbols, they were maps, layers upon layers of cartography spiralling inward. Coastlines from different ages overlapped each other. Earth as it was before the ice, Earth during the ice, Earth as it might be after the ice. And between these maps were patterns I didn't recognise, shapes that belonged to worlds I'd never seen. The tone inside me began to harmonise with something beneath the spiral, a deep bass that didn't vibrate through the water so much as through the bones of the planet. My skin prickled, my vision narrowing to a tunnel that led straight into the spiral's heart. I thought of the void, of the living surface, of the sentence I had changed. This was the place where that change would be recorded, where their sentence and ours would merge into something neither fully theirs nor fully ours. I wasn't sure if that was an act of creation or desecration. Rojas broke the silence. "You're shaking." I hadn't realised it until she said it. "It's not fear. Not exactly." My voice was low, almost swallowed by the hum. "It feels like standing on the edge of a word that's too big to speak." She gave a tight nod. "Then let's say it together." We reached the centre. The spiral's final curve widened into a perfect circle, a smooth depression in the stone no larger than the sub's cockpit. And there, resting in the hollow, was an object so simple it was almost invisible. A sphere of black stone, identical to the one I had found years ago, only this one pulsed faintly, in time with the tone in my head. The hum inside me surged, and the word, my word, rose to the surface. I could feel it pressing against my teeth, ready to leave me again. But it wasn't the same act as before. This wasn't surrender. This was placement. I opened my mouth, and the sound that emerged was not human. It was the note the sphere had been waiting for, the resonance that would let it speak back. The pulse in the sphere quickened, then expanded, spilling into the spiral. Light, or something like it, raced outward along the grooves, igniting each carved map in sequence, the past, the present, the possible. As they lit, the water seemed to vanish, replaced by an endless horizon where all these Earths existed at once, layered over each other like pages in a book too vast to read. I saw hands again, thousands of them, passing the sphere from one to another across millennia. And then, abruptly, they were gone, replaced by my own reflection in the glass of the viewport. The spiral dimmed, the hum faded, the sphere lay still. The silence was so complete, it felt dangerous. Rojas whispered, "Did we finish it?" I didn't know how to answer, because as I stared down at the now dark spiral, I felt something else, faint, distant, but undeniable. The sentence wasn't over, it was waiting. The words echoed in my skull long after I'd thought them, as though something in the depths had claimed them, and was testing their weight before returning them to me. The stillness of the ocean pressed in from all sides, and I had the unsettling feeling that even the currents beyond the spiral were holding position, listening. Rojas exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the viewport. If it's waiting, for what? I didn't answer immediately. I was staring at the sphere, black and inert now, but no less heavy with meaning. The maps around it had dimmed, but they hadn't vanished. Faint etchings still traced the grooves, as if the memory of the light was burned into the stone. My mind kept returning to the image of all those overlapping Earths, each a possibility, each a history in its own right. The sphere had shown us something, but not everything. It had chosen restraint, and that, more than anything, frightened me. The sub's instruments flickered, not malfunctioning, responding. Pressure reading shifted slightly, like something massive had moved far below us. Rojas noticed it too. Her hands hovered over the controls. We should leave before... Before what? Before the sentence ended, or before it began? The thought came unbidden, and I realised that what scared me most wasn't that the sphere had stopped. It was that it might start again, in a way we couldn't control. What if this wasn't the end of their story, I asked quietly. What if it's the beginning of ours? She looked at me sharply, but there was no disbelief in her eyes, only a grim acknowledgement. We had crossed a threshold, seen a version of the earth that didn't belong to us, and returned with more than we came for. That word, transformed, still resonated faintly in my chest. Whatever connection had been made down here, it wasn't severed. I reached out instinctively toward the viewport, my fingers brushing cold glass. "It's still out there," I murmured. "The rest of the sentence." The moment I said it, I felt a subtle shift in the pressure around us, like a door had opened somewhere in the depths. It was so faint Rojas didn't seem to notice, but I knew. The waiting was over, and yet nothing happened. No light, no hum, no impossible visions of overlapping worlds. Just the ocean, vast and dark, settling back into its own silence. Which left me with a question I couldn't escape. Had the sphere finished speaking, or had it just passed the word to us, leaving the next part to be written in our time? Rojas finally powered the sub's thrusters. We can't stay here forever. But even as the spiral receded below us, I knew we hadn't left it behind. The map, the real map, wasn't in the stone. It was in the resonance, in the altered way I now saw the world. The coastlines, the ice, the shifting shapes of continents. I could almost see them moving, changing, as if the past and future were transparent layers over the present. When we broke the surface, the sky was grey, the sea churning under the wind. The icebergs we had passed earlier were gone, as if the season had leapt forward without warning. Rojas stared at the horizon for a long time before speaking. "No one will believe this." "That's not what matters," I said. "What matters is what we do with it." The hum inside me had faded to something so soft I almost couldn't hear it anymore. But it wasn't gone, and as we set course for shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't just discovered an ancient truth, we'd been drafted into it. If they were here before us, what mistakes might we be repeating? Could our own age vanish as quietly as theirs, or is that how every story ends? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to Planet Echoes for the next chapter in the world's hidden history.